Hello and welcome to World Archery's Elite Coaching Seminar 2020, uniquely taking place online. We're here today and again in November with content and discussion for top level coaches from all around the world. On today's program, we'll be covering the differences between coaching compound and recurve athletes, using data as an effective coaching tool, the role coaches play in anti-doping, and a little bit later, we'll have a guide to tuning a recurve bow. We split the lectures into 2 sessions, and you should have received login details for both. We'll have an hour-long break for lunch, if you're in my time zone, but we'll also be having breaks in between each of the presentations, so you can grab a quick cup of tea or coffee. At the end of the day, we'll have a live Q&A session with all of the speakers from today's presentations. And if you'd like to submit a question, you can do so in one of 2 ways. You can email us at info@archery.sport with your question and, of course, who it's for, or you can use Twitter. Use the hashtag Archery Coaching Seminar in your tweet and we'll pick it up. Some of you may be invited to join the Q&A a little bit later today. So on to our presentations. Our first presentation comes from Robert Turner. He's the High Performance Programs Manager for Archery Australia. This extensive presentation covers the differences between coaching recurve and compound athletes.
G'day everyone, welcome to the 9th World Archery Coaches Seminar. My name's Robert Turner and today we're going to be having a session on differences in coaching compound athletes from recurve athletes. Now unfortunately I can't be delivering this to you in person today, obviously with COVID-19 and some of the issues going on. That's very unfortunate, but I'm hoping that this can be as interactive as possible. This session will go for approximately 1 hour and 45 minutes long, at the end of which we'll have a live question and answer session. For those that might be seeing this on the YouTube channel following this, unfortunately there will be no chance for you to ask questions, but I do hope that you can take something from this session and use it in your daily coaching routine. So before we get started, I thought it quite interesting, this slide itself has images of obviously the compound and recurve athletes, but I'd like to pose a question to you as a group. And that question is, what do you think the differences in coaching compound and recurve athletes are? In this seminar, there should be obviously a wide range of coaching skills, backgrounds and information. Some countries that have a lot of recurve, a lot of compound, or vice versa, or a good mix. And I'd like you to think about just yourself, what do you think the differences are between coaching a compound athlete and a recurve athlete? At all levels, beginner, intermediate, and advanced. In this seminar, we will try and cover those 3 areas. It is a very broad section, but I think it's really important for you to think about it yourself. How do I approach the compound athlete versus a recurve athlete? And are there any differences? Now, before we move into the actual meat of the presentation, I want to quickly introduce myself. Obviously, again, I'm Robert from Australia. I've been doing archery for about 23 years, and currently I work for the Archery Australia High Performance team. I've been lucky enough to work in the archery industry for many years and have a range of roles. Recently worked for World Archery in the Oceania region as a development officer, and I've also coached the Chinese Taipei, or the Taiwanese national compound team, for 2017 and 2018, as well as a range of other nations as well, New Zealand and the US and Australia, Papua New Guinea as well as their national coach in both compound and recurve archery. Myself as an archer, I started in the sport as a young 15-year-old and have shot both compound and recurve at about an international level. That actual interaction with the archery world, being an archer and a coach, has given me a great background in working with both athletes at all ranges of levels, from the very club and beginner level all the way through to more advanced. So I guess it's really important to note that this presentation will focus on compound archery. A little bit of background on the compound bow. is that it was created in the late 60s and the early 70s. Initially was taken from recurve parts and then put together and shot with their fingers traditionally. Now it's obviously changed dramatically in the few years that it's been around. But its first World Archery Championship was seen in Indonesia in 1995. So we're nearly into the sort of 26th year of compound at the World Archery Championship level. So about 13 World Championships have had compound. And unfortunately, there's limited resources on compound-specific information. Now, this is from national sporting organizations, as well as even World Archery. It has limited resources on compound-specific information. And typically, you'll see those resources will be recurve focused. Now, part of this presentation today is to talk about the differences between the two bow types. But actually, we'll be looking a lot at some of the similarities between the two. And you'll also note that since there are so many similarities, that a lot of the recurve information can be used in the compound context. Now, in terms of resources that I suggest, ones that I might use, these are some that I will look at on a regular basis. I think these are relatively simple, but also give a good detail for both the beginner, intermediate, and the more advanced archers. My favorite would be a book by Clint Freeman, a very famous Australian compound archer, world champion, world record holder, called Compound Archery My Way. Very structured, very good book. Others that have compound-specific information, obviously the World Archery Coaches Manual Level 2 has a series of pages you can look for. There are a ton of information sources out there on YouTube. People like George Riles, John Dudley, Paige Pierce. These guys, Chris B, have a lot of information that can help you around the equipment, the technique, the mental sort of preparations for the compound bow. And there are a couple others around mastering archery and fundamentals of compound target archery that are quite compound specific documents that can help you obviously in your education. Other more recurve centric pieces, and ones that we will look at in some of our slides later today, is actually the World Archery Level 1 and Level 2 coaches course and manuals. You can find them on World Archery's website. These have a lot of information around the shot sequence and the steps of shooting a bow that can easily translate to the compound bow as well. Now, I know in this group there'll be a range of coaches. Nedson might have from international level, some of the highest compound coaches around, all the way through to potentially some of our newer member association beginner coaches. So just for those lower level coaches that might not know the two differences between the compound and the recurve bow, here's two images on this slide of each of them. You can see the archer with the compound bow on the left. What that bow has is a few differences, obviously, from the recurve bow on the right. Those differences are that the draw length is very, very consistent. Those wheels at the top and bottom of the bow are called cams, and they have an adjustable draw length system. That means you can pull it back and get the exact draw length every time. It also has a lower holding weight due to the design of those wheels or cams. It means that athlete will not be holding a high amount of poundage at full draw. They'll also use a peep in their string, which is a round circular device to look through. They'll also look at and use as their aiming device a magnified scope, which has a bubble typically in it as well. And finally, you'll note that that archer is holding onto a release device, a mechanical device. That device actually helps them let go of that string. And obviously the differences with the recurve bow is there's a variable draw length. They're typically holding a lot higher holding weight. There is no rear sight. They have only a very simple pin to aim with. And obviously they're using their fingers to let go of that string. Now, I've made some comments underneath those points, which is, yes, the recurve can be a very accurate system. And that can be noted with some of the scores that are coming out today, and the world level especially. It depends on the user, obviously, their practice. With the compound, it also is a very accurate system. It's a very simple mechanical system. And typically you'll see that you can actually have greater success faster with the compound bow, meaning that your scores can be improved quite quickly with the compound bow, as there is more mechanical sort of devices, more matching and aiming devices, and less forces on the body while shooting the bow. Now, as a quick announcement, I've already mentioned this before in previous slides, is that recurve technique is actually extremely close to that of compound. Now, that might be contentious, and it's something that we can discuss at the end of this presentation, and that is your thoughts as a coach between how closely they do match and whether they should be, say, put in the same basket, or are they different? So my thoughts is that compounds with the less forces on their body at full draw, it allows for greater accuracy. And you'll find a lot more variety in some compound technique, especially at the world level. There's a lot of different structures to people's bodies and how they activate releases, what releases they're using, what bow setups. But in general, I find myself coach very similar from the beginner, intermediate, and advanced as I would with a recurve, as I do with a compound. Now, there are some differences, and that can be due to many factors. That could be where you are located in the world. So geographically, if you are based in the Asian region, there is typically a lot stronger recurve technique focus there. And a lot of the archers, the compound archers coming out of that region, have a very recurve structured shot, meaning they're very straight, very aligned when they're shooting their bow. In a Western context where some of these coaches might not have any interactions with the recurve world, you may find that their posture and positioning is slightly different. Some of the other factors that may change the technique or how an archer uses their bow, compound and recurve, specifically more compound, is how they began, so what bow they were taught with. Typically, you'll find the recurve transfer athletes to compound, again, have more of a recurve-esque type positioning of their body. And then finally, who is their coach? So you guys in the presentation today, watching this seminar, know your backgrounds, have varied backgrounds, and your own information and how you teach may vary the actual structure of the athlete and the technique they're using. But for me, and in my own opinion, I actually teach very as I do with the recurve bow. Now, today's presentation will actually be looking at some information from World Archery's Level 1 and Level 2 Coaches course. Now, this information you should already know if you've taken one of these courses. These are the 4 phases of World Archery shot routines. That's the preparatory movements, the production of force, the critical instant, and then the continuity or follow-through piece. I think it's important to also understand that these are meant to be linked in a sequence, so they're actually connected, not rather separate. And from a compound perspective, I'm going to be looking at these in consequent slides in this presentation to talk about some of the areas that I think are very similar to the recurve, but also those that are different. Obviously, in each one of these steps, the preparatory movements, the production of forces, etc., there are other steps within that number. So number 1, preparatory movements, there's actually a series of other steps within that section, and I'll be pulling those out, and the ones that I think are more specific to compound. So before moving on to the next slide, I'm also going to try and look at beginners, intermediate, and more advanced. So the 3 types of levels that you might come across as a coach. Now, you in this presentation might be having more of the advanced archers or more of the intermediate, if you'll say some sort of pathways, or if you're more of a beginner coach, you're only going to be dealing with the very new to the sport. So I'm going to try and cover off those 3 areas in the best way possible, but obviously in an hour and 45, that's difficult to do. The first one I'll talk about here is the beginners. So having coached athletes at all 3 of those levels myself, and being an athlete at those levels as well, I understand that each one of them will have slightly a different sort of mentality from that coach. And I guess it's really important to note that engaging someone with a compound bow in the first instance can be much more time consuming. So you as a coach, if you are dealing with a new compound athlete, must consider that extra timing. Draw length and setting of poundage, the peep height, and then learning how to use the release aid can be very time consuming. I used to say about 20 to 30 minutes extra on one archer to try and get those aspects correct. It's one of those ones where you must plan appropriately. The second one you'll see is talking about some of the actual content you use to teach them. So often in the recurve setting, you'll see, and you'll see the image on the right here of me drawing back a rubber band. That tool is used heavily in the development of technique and learning how to shoot with a recurve bow. They can be used in the compound, but what you will find is that often we'll use the string bow. So that's the image on the lower right-hand side. That is a much more valuable tool than the rubber band. That is because it has a hard stop, and you can change the draw length relatively easily on that and focus on some of the more preparatory positions or placement of the archer's body. You can use a recurve bow, and typically they are used at the beginner levels. You'll see that at your local clubs. You'll see that as one of your higher level athletes needs to change their techniques. But it is not the same as using a compound bow, obviously. There are bows that exist that are relatively adjustable in draw length, but the recurve bow can be set up with a D-loop on it if you need to. So I guess one of the things you will have to obviously consider is the size of your group. If you're going to do this with a larger group, make sure you have the appropriate time. One-on-one would be best, especially if you're working with a young archer. So you can see the image on the right-hand side at the top here. So that's me working with a young archer in the US. One-on-one is the best in terms of setting up the draw length, making sure the poundage, peep, and release are being activated appropriately. As I mentioned, you could use some beginner bows. The Mathews Genesis or the Genesis Pro is a very good option. They're very strong. They're very great for beginners, but they do have no let-off. So they're actually not a compound and they're not a recurve either. So they're a very interesting bow to use. As I mentioned before, you can use a recurve with a D-loop on it. And often teaching an archer with the recurve bow can be one of the most effective ways to move into the compound. So that is, they learn the basic rules, safety of shooting their bow before moving on to the compound. Now, at this level, at the beginner level of teaching, of coaching in archery, I think this is quite general and the same for a recurve in compound, is there's a lot more dictating from me, the coach, to the athlete than there is, say, a freedom or exchange of how the archer feels and how they shoot their bow. So I think that's one of the first similarities you'll find with the compound and the recurve, even at the basic beginner level, is that you, the coach, will have to do a lot more mandating or dictating to the archer. Here's how you will stand. Here's how you will hold the bow. Here's how you will shoot the bow initially. That will change, and we'll discuss that as we move through some of our slides when we go to the intermediate phase and the more international higher level phase. So moving on, we can see here the 4 phases of World Archery's shot sequence, basically. This is the steps that World Archery believe an archer should be taking towards shooting an arrow. Now, these steps may differ in your country. That's totally fine, and you may be using a certain type of shot sequence, but in general, most of them will have these similar type steps. So obviously I've color coordinated the major area here, the preparatory movements, and these are some on the right-hand side of the breakdown steps within that larger step. I'll be in coming slides showing or going through some of the ones that I think are similar or different with the compound bow. But before we get into that, I do want you to think about this list here on the right-hand side and think, what are some of the differences that you might have when dealing with a compound archer? What are some of the things you would do differently with a recurve archer? Or what would you do the same for both? Now, I won't cover all of these steps. If I did, this presentation would go quite a long time. And unfortunately, it's going to be me delivering most of these to you. At the end of this session, we can discuss some of these that you might want to talk about, that we may have moved straight past. As one of them is stance, that I will not cover. This is something that you might be very firm with. For me, it's not the biggest issue when it comes to differences with recurve and compound, but it's one of those things that you might be interested in learning more about or want to discuss with the group. So, moving on. The preparatory movements. I'm going to be talking first about the release hand and grip. So, obviously, I think the stance is relatively similar. You will find some differences in the width of that stance. Typically, compounders might stand a little bit closer is the general trend, but there are a range of differences in the more open and closed stances around the world, and we can all talk about in the question and answer session about some of the archers you do know and why they have done that, because there are some differences with that. Knocking the arrow obviously is pretty simple, and the first one, that release hand, is the one I'd like to discuss. So here you can see actually some images of archers at full draw, but these images are about that hand position into the release and how they have that hand actually connected and how they're using that hand when drawing. One of the things that I did do in image number 2 is take a picture from the World Archery Coaches course around that position, the release hand and grip, because actually what we're looking for here is that straight line and back of the wrist and forearm that needs to be consistent. Now you'll see that with each 3 athletes I've used in these images as well, and that's the first similarity I'd like to discuss, is that the release hand and how you hold that release is actually very, very similar to the recurve bow. It should be a nice straight line through to the elbow. The idea is to try and reduce tension in your wrist, and especially depending on what type of release aid you're going to use, to then move that freely to then have that fire. And poor positioning can lead to some rather difficult situations, so that can lead to punching off their release, which is obviously something you've heard about, target panic, or say commanding their release at an inopportune time. One of the things that the recurve archers talk about a lot as well, and typically their hands will be straight on the string, is the angle in which the release aid should be held. Now, I've also used these images on purpose because here you can see 2 different types of angle, and that is on image number 1, the young woman from Chinese Taipei is shooting with that hand quite flat or horizontal, where on image number 3, that gentleman on the Chinese Taipei national team is holding that release quite vertical. Now, what is wrong here, what is right here, doesn't actually matter because both are effective. And you will see this across the sort of realm with the compound and recurve differences, is that there's a lot more room to move with the compound than there is with the recurve. So I prefer actually between those 2 marks, which is the vertical position of the image in number 3 and the flat in number 1. I actually like right in the middle of that, about 45 degrees, but it's personal preference. And it also depends on a range of topics, which is what release aid they've chosen, how they activate that release aid, where they've anchored on their face. These things all have to be taken into account. And initially working with the beginner archers, things that I would suggest, and I think you might already know, is to start at one position, and I'd usually go with that 45 degrees. And then as they progress into intermediate and more high level, allow for that adaptation to occur. Now, obviously you can also see in image number 4, this is another archer with a very vertical style of holding their release. But that line through that forearm and wrist is really what we're trying to do with both the recurve and the compound release aid. You will find differences, considerable and dramatic differences around the world. Now, moving on, another area I'd like to discuss or highlight from World Archery's preparatory movement is the bow hand and elbow. I'll be talking more about the bow hand than I will the elbow, but again, it's another instance of an extreme similarity than a difference. Now, with the compound, setting your grip is extremely important. With a recurve, it is the same. It's the only place you get to touch your bow on the riser. It is the same for compound. But due to the lower holding weight of an archer at full draw, the ability to turn, twist, or torque that bow is increased dramatically. So obviously the lower holding weight means the bow is easier to move. The grips themselves are different from the recurve grips. You'll see a wider, higher angle on the recurve bows than you will with the compound bows. This is very normal. There are some coaches, and if they might be on this discussion today, that actually like quite an angled grip. That is a new and somewhat interesting topic. I think back in the past, compound bows often had very similar to recurve grips, but over time they have dramatically changed to just the riser and a lot lower. One of the things you have to be very mindful of is that this grip can greatly affect how your bow tunes. And a part of that is also how your side rod or V-bar setup on the compound is placed. So the greater the weight and the further out those actually are, actually a singular side rod, it can greatly change that pressure or torque on your bow. So grip can really affect some of your tuning. And similar to our last slide, I've added an image here, image number 1, from the World Archery Coaches Course. This image from, actually created from Kim Hyung Tak, I believe, is of an archer's hand into a recurve bow. Images 2, 3, and 4 are obviously of a young compound archer here in Australia and how they interact with that grip. Now, the actual parts and focus that I will have on that grip are very, very similar to the recurve to the compound. I see almost no difference between the two. Depending on where you're from geographically, this will change dramatically. I find most Eastern cultured or Asian area compound shooters have very good grips. Typically it's because they come from more of a recurve background, and more of the Western Europeans have a lot more variety in how they hold that bow to where they're holding a little more unorthodox, say. Now, obviously varying pressure in that position can cause a lot of issue, especially with the lower holding weight, and you must be consistent and relaxed. You'll see that 45-degree line on image number 1 is very important. So that knuckle angle is something that I think you're looking for with the compound just as much as you're looking for with the recurve. And the digits themselves, the fingers themselves, must be relaxed. So moving on to talk more about the grip itself, how do you coach this? And this is part of the point around the same with how you held that release aid. It's the same with how you draw back your bow, how you anchor. How do you coach these positions in a compound? It's actually very, very similar to the recurve bow. Here you'll note on the image on the far left, there's an archer with their knuckles nice at 45 degrees. You'll see his hand pushing in. The idea is to get your radius bone behind the center of your bow as best as you can. And then you'll see also there's a picture of Braden Galantine here, who has, I think, a really fantastic grip. His thumb is pointing directly to the target. And on the lower right-hand side, image number 4, you'll see that the archer has a thumb curled and is tight around that, and their grip angle has changed slightly. So there's a little pressure over that wrist. This is a very poor grip and needs to be managed. And how do you manage that, or how do you coach that, I guess, is the question that we put out in this slide. And we can discuss this again as a group as well, but for me, it's the same principles as the recurve. You know, the 45 degrees, the coach interaction, you actually standing in front and manipulating the bow into their hand and directing them is literally the same way that I will deal with a compound archer as well as a recurve archer. Same with how they hold their release aid, and same with how they'll get into their anchor position, is that I will manipulate and help them with that. When you watch how to look at the grip itself, just as a specific piece, and how to help that position or aid them in developing a better grip is watching that bow raising, and then also all the way through to follow through, how they change or if they change and any tendencies they might have is the way that I would look at helping a compounder with that grip position. Pressure, variety in the grip, any sort of movements in the fingers are all very worrying with a compound bow. And because they're very focused on aiming, any sorts of small movements and the fact that there is a lower holding weight, typically you will find that any sorts of changes here can have a greater effect than a recurve bow will on the target. So moving on with some of the preparatory movements, obviously we've talked about the string hand holding your release. We've also talked about the bow hand. I do want to touch on the body pre-setting. So you'll notice, again, I'm using some images here from the World Archery Coaches Courses Level 1 and Level 2. But for me, these preparatory movements and placement of your body is actually very, very similar. I will teach that, especially in more of the beginner level. As they get more advanced, and say if they're already established archers, say, that have begun without my help, you will find in the compound a bit of a difference here. So every one of you will already know some of the higher level compound archers around the world that might not have, say, the similar to image number 1, this great straight shoulders and hips position. Now that's totally okay, and that's where the differences, some of the big differences between compound and recurve lie. Personally, especially with the beginner level and more intermediate level archers, this is a very important aspect that I try and maintain the recurve positioning with the compound. So the body positioning, during the raising, this pre-draw and draw, in my mind, is actually very, very similar to the recurve. The head should be still, shoulders and hips aligned, wherever possible. Coaching this is the exact same way. You can use a range of tools to actually initiate this, but I've actually used these images, of course, to highlight the fact of that similarity that I'm looking for. So image number 1, Maya Jaeger, an image out of Kim Hung Tak and the World Archery presentation. You'll see, obviously, the image number 2 is that same angle with an athlete with the same position. Typically, what you will find in this straighter position, there'll be less forces or stress on the body. And if you have the right draw length, this means that the athlete can have very low stress on their body and then obviously try and repeat that and be able to repeat that more readily, say, under stress of the high-level competition or just competition in general. You'll also see in image number 3 from that back view, the archer is nice and straight. And similarly, in image number 4, the 2 athletes there, is that I'm looking for that same position wherever possible. It's very repeatable. It should be very easy for the athlete to find themselves. But again, this is where a difference may occur between your own thoughts and my thoughts, is that you will find, and it's relatively easy to find, more variety amongst, say, all of the archers at one World Cup, variances in how they hold this body position. Where in the recurve, you'll find a lot less variance in that posture, in that positioning at full draw. Now, it is heavily connected with the equipment and the draw length they've chosen. This is a very vital piece, and we'll talk about that in the coming slides. But in general, I'm looking for the same positioning, and I coach it in the same way, which is to actually use my images, hold their hip or their shoulder and push them into position. Any other tool that you might be using to do that. And I think it can really benefit and grow or develop your compound archers very, very quickly if you get this quite well. So the final position in the preparatory movements is raising the bow. And I just wanted to highlight just a quick little piece here around the differences between the recurve and compound. And an archer here, the image here is out of New Zealand. And he is just picking up his bow or raising his bow, and then we'll draw the bow. And you can see here, the big difference is actually that the brace height of the compound is typically a bit shorter. It's say 6 to 7 inches, where the recurve will have sort of 8 to 9 inches. And obviously the compound, the mass weight or the drawing weight, the maximum will be at that brace height. So the archer must overcome almost 60 pounds if they're shooting the maximum draw weight at that very early position. So one of the things you will find is that that drawing shoulder will be a little bit higher than, say, some of the recurve bow, because they'll have one of their lightest poundages at that brace height. There's also a little bit bigger brace height as well for them to deal with. But what you can see in this athlete or this archer is that the head is still over the shoulders are still over the hips, and they're maintaining that position. So despite the extra poundage at that brace height as they pick up their bow, they are actually still trying to maintain that position. And that's really good, just the consistency, obviously. And you'll see in the following slide, as he draws that back, that he attempts to keep his head in that position whilst he draws. So here you can see we're now moving into the production of forces phase of this presentation, or of the World Archery sequence, those 4 steps that they typically talk about. And you'll see if I push the play button on this archer, I have it set to scroll through. They actually keep that head and their shoulders and their hip nice and steady as they're drawing that back, despite having 59, 60 pounds of pressure to overcome as they begin that draw sequence. Now, one of the problems you may see is overbowing in terms of excessive weight, and then also you may see poor draw length selection. Now, I've also added an image on the lower left here of a very beginner archer using one of my bows. And I have a very long draw length, and I don't shoot a very heavy poundage, about 55 pounds personally, but it's difficult for that individual to pull that back. And this is some of the highlighting of the issues that can arise when you have a poor poundage and a poor draw length setup. You'll note that the body is obviously leaning back quite heavily, and that is something we talked about in the earlier slide around structuring your head, shoulders, and hips, that you can still see with the recurve bow. So if an archer isn't controlling these positions, this is not a recurve, this is not a recurve and compound issue, it is an archery issue. If you have too much draw weight, if you have, say, a bad positioning of your clicker, would be another example in the recurve world, to say too far back, you might find your athlete really leaning back or moving back as they actually try and activate that shot. The video of the young man is, I think, the best practice, and there are variations in compound, given you have the peak and the scope, given you have a set draw length, and given you have a release aid, it can be different. And again, you will know plenty of archers across the world that, say, don't have that position being held in space because they have these, peeps and scopes to match. But again, my preference is to have this position wherever possible. Now, moving on with the production of forces, we talk about face marks and references. Obviously, you might know that as the anchor position. And with compound, there are a lot of similarities yet again. One of the big ones for me is that excessive facial pressure here can be very dangerous for you. And I've used 4 images here of athletes from around the world that I think have relatively too excessive pressure on their face. So not just where their hand is anchoring, but where their string is touching. And that's because the compound bow is typically holding a lot less weight. So some of these bows are typically, say, 60 to 80% let-offs. There are some higher, which means that they might be holding as little as, say, 7 to 10 pounds at full draw. And that means that if you have too much pressure on your face, it can vary where that string is in space, which will vary where the arrow lands greatly. This is a bit of a difference from the recurve bow. Obviously, too much pressure on the face of the recurve, where they distort their face with pressure of the string, is not suggested. But because they're holding a lot higher holding weight, which typically for men it's into the 50 pounds now, In the women, it's sort of the high levels in the mid 40s. This is not a huge issue, but in the compound it is, and it's something you need to be very mindful of. In windy conditions, I made mention in the notes on the side here that you can change the pressure under longer timing to shoot the arrow. You'll find some archers manipulating and changing head pressure and positioning. It can be devastating to an archer's results and consistency. And some of the things you might want to look at is, why is that occurring? Why people are touching their face so deeply? It could be the draw length, and again, we'll go over that soon, how to look at draw lengths. But it could also be a few things around the bow's axle to axle length. And typically in the Asian nations, when I was working there was a lot of interest in trying to get the string to touch their nose. And I think it was because they were from a recurve background, perhaps this is where most of them came from. But it's actually not necessary. It's not needed. The peep itself is the reference point. You can touch your nose, you can touch your face, but you must be very careful of the consistency of it. So I do mention a few of the factors you might want to be careful of, and that's the axle to axle of the bow. The greater the axle to axle, obviously the string angle will change into a higher pitch, and you've got more chance of touching your face. But again, you should choose an axle to axle bow that suits you and your draw length, not just because you want to touch your face. Your facial shape, whether you're more of that Asian sort of face or a bigger nosed, that does make a difference. How you position your body does vary, and then obviously your draw length as well. If you want to touch your nose with the string, it's not necessary to move your head down, to have that back further. All you have to do is actually move your hand up against your face, rather than do these other options that could cause a lot more stress. So this is a pretty big difference between the compound and the recurve. Again, I'm interested in your own feedback, your own thoughts of this as compound coaches, perhaps. Some issues you might have seen. There's plenty of archers out there that have a lot of contact. And in fact, two of these athletes are ones that I worked with. So, I do have to deal with this on an athlete-to-athlete basis, especially as you're moving towards more of the elite level. But at the beginner and intermediate level, I think you should be considering less facial contact where possible. It should be light. It should be consistent if you want to have accuracy to a very, very high level. Now, moving on to more of the preparatory, actually, we're going to revisit some of the preparatory movements, because we've now got to this position where we're at full draw, we're about to activate the release, and I wanted to make note of this string hand and how you hold the release. And there's three images here of archers, from around the world, that are holding different types of release aids, or holding their release aids in an interesting way. And there's a few lines on these that make a difference. The idea we talked about earlier in this presentation about having that nice and flat, that is the preferred method. Now, each one of these three athletes are a national team level, medalists in some way, shape or form at, say, Asia Cups, and one of them is a World Cup finalist a couple of times, and another is a Pacific Games gold medalist as well. Is that this can be effective, but what you'll find is that when you have that wrist breaking, one of the things you can find is excess tension in your forearms and hands to fire the release. And a big part of compound archery is the aiming and using of a release aid. So it's just one of these points that I wanted to highlight, that this can occur. And in fact, these three archers are relatively high level, but the preference, especially for the beginner and intermediate level, is to not have this, have it straighter. It allows them to connect more with their larger back muscles, which hopefully should be activated and used during their release method. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. But these variances can occur, and this is another difference with the recurve, in that these three options can all be effective. With the recurve, if you had an archer that has these kinds of movements, the chances of their success are just less. So part of the discussions have been obviously around these four phases of World Archery's coaching method. One of the things I did want to heavily discuss is draw length selection, purely because it is so important. Now, with a recurve bow, the draw length is whatever you want it to be, basically. It's not stopping. With the compound bow, you physically have to set a set draw length for you, or for the archer, and it is probably the most critical selection, I feel, around the posture and less stress on your body. Other critical areas are going to be your release aid and ability to aim, how you use those. But this is that first phase of getting your athlete much more successful. Now, I personally have a method here that I'll discuss, my 3-step method for draw length selection. I am interested always in how other archers or coaches select this draw length. It might be a little contentious for you, some of these, so I'm keen to discuss this in the question and answers. But I'll go through mine and we can discuss that later on. The 3 areas that I look for is that first, their body position. So this series of images is talking about the athlete's body position. You will see in image number 1 and number 2, the same athlete pulling back their bow. And you can see in image number 1 that that athlete has a bit of a sway or a bend in their body. And image number 2, they have their body nice and straight. So for me, if they're moving that body as they're drawing or as they're at full draw, it can be quite difficult to prescribe or give that athlete the right draw length for their success. But as you know, there are many athletes with that number 1 type position that have been very successful. You can see here in images number 3 and 4, these are 2 Chinese Taipei national team members. This is my preference in terms of how they hold their body posture. It also means that I'm able to look at their specific draw length with the bow they have and how they activate their release, and I think get a very good result for them. Some of the things you might want to have in terms of tips around this is making sure you don't just look from this one angle. So here I've given you just one view of these 4 athletes. So that's the facing view. You must make sure you get around the athlete from the side and the back to better understand if they are actually moving their body upwards in space and if they're kinking their sort of from their hips or anything like this. There are some changes that you must be aware of when it comes to the D-loop length, when it comes to the release aid you're using. So the head length can change dramatically. They have now bows with draw length adjustments on their grip. So if you're adding angles and changes, that does change ever so subtly that draw length. Please make sure you try and correct the body position first, then get that bow draw length in position. And I won't change a draw length until I've done each one of my 3 steps for selecting the draw length before I change a draw length on an archer. So I'll go through each one of these before saying definitively that they need to change longer or shorter. Also be aware that the peep itself can change that sort of position of the body. So when the peep is set too high, they can often be searching for it. When it's set too low, you'll see them scrunching down and changing that posture. So it can be done without a peep, but I suggest having it in there and having it the right height, obviously, before you do this. Now, the second step, obviously, is a bit of an interesting one that some people may disagree with. It's just using the D-loop to the center of the eyelid, which is looking at the peep and the D-loop and having them try and match at the archer's eye that they aim with. You can see here on image number 1, there's an athlete with a very far back draw length and anchor position, and his D-loop is quite behind his eye. Now, this archer is a near national team member and a relatively good shot, considering that his country is quite difficult to make the national team on. But here you can see in image number 2 where he changed that position, and the chances of him touching his face, we talked about facial pressure already, is reduced. And also the forces on his body, how that affects his shoulder positioning and how he activates his release, greatly changes. You'll see in image number 3, I think a good example of a D-loop to the center of the eye, and that is a national team member, World Cup finalist, Asian Games medalist positioning. And I'm really happy with about an inch, basically. So that 2 centimeters, either in line or slightly behind. It really depends on the release, the D-loop, and where they've anchored as well. So for me, that ballpark of about an inch is available. I don't like too much in front, but behind about 2 centimeters would be appropriate too, depending on the person, the posture, and the alignment. Finally, that alignment. So this is a big one for the recurve compound difference. Now, this one is, I don't think, too contentious in terms of amongst coaches around the world, and that is that the arrow line, or this arrow line going through their bow, must be in line with their elbow. I prefer this wherever humanly possible. It means that the forces on the body are reduced. And you can see images 1, 2, and 3 that all of these archers have relatively that elbow in line with that arrow. And I think it's the best way to shoot your bow. Now in the recurve, it's actually very similar. It's a great similarity between the two. That I think, especially for beginner and intermediate levels, that you want this positioning similar in terms of that elbow in line. There are some coaches and methods out there that are looking for the elbow behind the line of the arrow. And in fact, some of my statements earlier in this presentation still ring true, is that you will still find greater difference with the compounds than you will with the recurve. So I'll show you a slide in a second that talks about some of the differences, and in fact, how they can actually be quite effective as well. And I guess that might be the overarching method here in this presentation, is that whilst there's, I think, a lot of similarity between the two, the compound has just a greater spectrum of sort of differences that it allows and can be successful. So I did make a little comment here in the slide about draw length, recurve versus compound. Typically what I do find is that a recurve archer's draw length is slightly longer than a compound's, and I typically see about 1/2 inch to about 1.5 inches, depending on the archer, the size of the shoulders, where they anchor, etc. It's a good one to know if you have an archer going from recurve to compound, so you could use a relatively similar draw length to them, minus 1 inch or so. And typically when I was working with the national team of Chinese Taipei, a lot of the work I did was around reducing draw lengths, but that also was because they came from a lot of recurve shooting, and that meant their tendency was to have a bit of a longer draw length. They were looking for that string and their face touching their nose, and I often had to try and shorten them where I could. So here are some other options that some are acceptable and some are not, and depending upon the athlete, their activation method, the bow they're using, the release they're using, it can be acceptable. Now in image number 1 and number 2, you'll see there's 2 high-level athletes, national team members, that have their elbow slightly behind the line. You can see in image 1 that it's just behind that line, and image 2, it's slightly further past. These 2 are actually acceptable. They shoot very well. They're actually, very high-level athletes themselves. And the forces and how they use their release aid, number 1 uses a back tension, and number 2 uses a thumb trigger, is actually quite acceptable. Image number 3 is probably the most poor example of positioning. You'll see the archer arching their back, that elbow very high in space, and then very behind the string and the arrow. This can be very stressful. I'm not saying this archer can't hit the target, because in fact that archer can, and quite effectively, but moving forward, you'd be looking to obviously have that more in line with some of the other options. And this is one of the differences you might see with the recurve as well, is that you might find, similar to image number 3 and 4, that quite a few high-level archers around the world have more of that number 4 image, which is that elbow slightly in front of the line. And that can be very, very effective. So I think number 3 is an issue there, but 1, 2, and 4 can be acceptable, and you will probably not see as much variety in the recurve as you will with the compound with this positioning. So moving on to the draw expansion. Now, this is actually, I want to talk about compound as at full draw and some of the difference between compound and recurve. Obviously, on the left side here, there's number 1, number 2 with the compound and recurve with a cartoon or an image of an archer at full draw. This is one of the big differences that typically is a little contentious. Some coaches believe that the recurve position must be the same as the compound, and vice versa. Not vice versa, that everyone should shoot the recurve alignment, which is the image number 2. But I do believe that the image number 1 is actually appropriate for compound as well. And that is that the 2 shoulder points basically line up with the arrow. So moving on to, continuing on with the period of the production of forces, we're now at full draw with the compound archer. We've looked at the anchor position, we've looked at how they've held the release, we've looked at how to set a draw length on one of these archers. One of the things I wanted to discuss is, I'm not going to actually talk about the draw expansion, which is one of the steps that we're up to now, and we'll cover that in sort of the next couple of slides. I want to talk more about the alignment of a compound archer versus a recurve archer. Here you can see on the left side of the screen, there's number 1 and number 2, which is a cartoon of an archer at full draw, both with a recurve bow. Now, with the recurve bow, that number 2 is the one that is most suggested. This is your 2 shoulders aligning with your bow arm and reducing the force on you dramatically. And I put at number 1, this more open position as a more compound trade. And it's a relatively contentious issue. Some of you coaches in the seminar today might think all compounders should also shoot in the recurve way. And I don't think that personally is the case. I do think where possible, we should look to get compound archers as close to that alignment as we can. But typically I see a lot more of that number 1 positioning, which is that shoulder, both of the shoulders being more in line with the arrow rather than those 2 shoulders being more in line with the bow arm with a compound bow. So for me, it's a relatively great difference between the compound and recurve. And you'll see that in a couple of the images I've used in number 3 and 4 on this slide, which is 2 archers at full draw from above. Now, you can see this is a fantastic image, obviously, to look at draw length and see where their elbow is, how they're holding that release. But it's also really fantastic to see these 2 shoulder positions, just like it would be with a recurve bow. But atypically, I think you see a lot more of these shoulders lining up with this arrow than you will see with a recurve 2 shoulders lining up with that bow arm. Now, as they're holding less weight, this is actually, I think, relatively appropriate. I don't like to see this shoulder too far out to the left in terms of that image in number 1, that front shoulder really turning out and having them quite open. But I'm more than happy to see that square with the arrow, like in image number 4. I think it's an important point to sort of discuss, and I'm definitely happy to talk more about it as we move along to the question and answers section. Now, I have bypassed how to use your release and activating the release, but I'll discuss that quite soon because that's where we're moving to next. But now I'm looking at that critical instant, so aiming and release, the 2 positions that are in the critical instant. Really, it's the sort of the crux of the critical instant, and that for compound is very important. So typically, compound is seen as quite an aiming focused type of our sport, and I would have to agree greatly. So rhythm seems to be a lot more critical, rhythm and alignment with the recurve bow. But I can say with the modern scores that are coming out of recurves, so a lot more guys reaching sort of 680 plus to that 700 mark that say Brady's been shooting, that aiming is getting more important with the recurve bow. But in general, I think I can say that rhythm and alignment is the more important with the recurve, where aiming is a very heavy skill for the compound. So there are a lot of variables to deal with the compound, and that can be the peep size. So that's the size of the ring in the string that the athlete is looking through, the type of a clarifier or verifier, if that archer is using one. So that's a piece of glass that fits in the peep. The scope size, so how big that scope is they're actually looking through, the power of that scope. So there's a magnification to that scope, and that can be from 2 power to 8 power is sort of the range you'll see across the archers, but typically it's sort of 4 to 6 in general. Pardon me, as the distance of that scope from the actual athlete. So, on your site, you can move that in and out. That changes the magnification or power of that scope. the size of the dot, the size of the ring they might be using in that scope, and then also the bubble. So how they're managing that, all the variables they have to deal with. Now, on this slide, I've actually taken an image from World Archery YouTube video, which was fantastic. It actually is Steve Anderson of the US and some of the women from the Eastern Foundations talking about what that visually looks like for a compounder. So you can see one person holding a black ring a little bit closer, which would be the peep. And the back, you can see a woman holding what would be the scope with a black dot, imitating the dot they're aiming with. For me, this skill of matching those is very important. So you must be able to maintain that match. And also the bubble management and where that dot is in space is very, very important. So when you talk to a lot of, say, the 3D shooters that are very prolific in the US, it's a very heavy aiming and execution, so release aid use version of our game. Or whether it's a target archer that's shooting at a really high level, when you're shooting at the compound level internationally, which is 700 plus is sort of the requirements really. And then let's face it, now at the top level, 710 plus is really, if you want to win a championship, where you need to basically be. That this ability to aim, this ability to manage these variables becomes critical. So I made some comments here around similar to the recurve. It has string picture, so that's where the string is versus the sight pin that they're using. They have to match that through the sequence of their sort of draw, this expansion phase, as some people will call it. We also, as compounders, have to make sure that that peep, scope, bubble, and dot management is also maintained as they're expanding or using their release date. There are some devices now that you will find on the market, which is like the Mantis or the Sweet Spot or the Bodometer, that is really looking at improving the balance. So that is, your stabilizers and your sight, but really that's all about trying to get your aiming better, your aiming more consistent, because it is such a vital skill with the compound. And that's, I guess, the main message with this slide is that this is one of the bigger differences from the recurve bow, and that is compounders will aim typically a lot more than a recurve bow. Now, the release. This is a very big topic in terms of how to use the different types of releases that exist. And I guess the main sort of crux of what I want to talk about quickly initially is that every kind of release can be effective and every kind of release can be shot poorly. Whether that's an index finger, a back tension, thumb trigger, all of these can be activated either well or badly, and you'll see that when you watch World Cups and national events, regional events, that there's a range of release types, and none of them are bad in my mind. It's actually making sure the athlete activates them well for themselves that matters. And about that, we're talking about activation release in terms of how they activate their releases. There are two main methods really, and that would be a surprise method and a command method. So these are a surprise, meaning that the athlete doesn't really know when their release will fire, versus the command method, which is the athlete is saying when they want that release to fire. In general, and personally, I look more for the surprise release version, but both can be highly effective. And when you speak with national level to international level compounders around the world, you will see a lot of variety if you ask that question, and how do you use your release? Do you command it? Do you surprise release it? You'll see a lot of variation here. Now, in each of those two styles, so that's the surprise and the command, there are different activation methods. So that is how the individual makes that release fire. It depends on the type of release they have, obviously, but for me, there's a few different styles or methods that you'll typically find. The most common would be the relaxing of the index finger that's holding the release aid. There's the relax all the fingers method. There's an increasing tension on the sort of ring and pinky fingers, so the smaller digits. increasing tension on all the digits exist and more push and pull. There's athletes that will actually lean their body and use that sort of body positioning. So for me, none of these are incorrect. And part of the skills that you might have as a coach or you might need is to actually try some of these methods and understanding your athletes, how they control themselves, how they think when they're actually activating the release aid is probably the more interesting topic here. But obviously without that interaction of in this seminar, we can talk about that perhaps in the question and answer section because it is a very interesting topic. None of these are negative in my mind. I've used most of these in, not the leaning body as much for me, but I've used most of these types of methods in arches across the world. It's understanding the athlete in terms of which one I'll choose and why. A big difference in yellow down the bottom, you'll note that that you might find between compound and recurve here is that the athlete releases with a recurve bow. Obviously, they're holding onto that string. They have to actively or maybe subconsciously, depends on the person, you know, it depends on who you talk to, actually open those or relax those fingers, really not open, relax those fingers and have that string slip through. Opening, I would never suggest that. When they relax, obviously the string will slip through. Typically, you won't find that with the compound. You do have some relaxing methods, but in general, they're having and maintaining some type of tension or positioning as that release fires. So you'll see typically, because they're holding onto a device, not using their fingers, that is a bit of a difference between the recurve and compound. As they're releasing, they're maintaining more of their tension versus a recurve that's, say, losing some tension just in that forearm. But I think the trick with the recurve is maintaining the back tension, which you'll hear a lot of athletes talking about. With the compound, often you'll see archers of having to use that back tension, and obviously I would suggest that, but they won't lose so much in the wrist and hand. How to help or how to coach your athlete to use a release aid is a big topic. If you're a beginner level coach or you're working with more beginner level athletes, even through to the more intermediate and advanced level athletes, this is probably an area that a lot of people will spend a lot of time on. So helping your archer to find that consistent release can be difficult, but it really depends on a few factors. So for me, what I like to teach archers to find more of a surprise release aid is to use a back tension release aid, the hinge, as some people might call it, or a rotational release aid. You'll hear it with many names. And that I like to use with no click. Typically, I'll give that to beginners and set it very slow, or what they would call cold, meaning that it will take a lot of effort or a lot of movement to fire. Once the archer becomes comfortable with that, I'll then change the settings slowly hotter or hotter, meaning that it's less and less rotation to find their happy space. But another good one to use is a resistance release aid. One of the things that I personally do, and you can see here in image number 1, is own a lot of release aids. Typically, I want to have just one type because I like one brand personally, but I want to have thumb buttons. I want to have wrist straps. I have a couple of those, back tensions, a safety back tension, or a resistance release aid. And I want to have them in various sizes because obviously everyone's hand sizes are different. And in terms of helping archers with their release, there's a couple of methods that obviously I've stolen images number 2 and 3 from the World Archery Level 2 coach's presentation. And that is, number 2 is the actual coach activating the release for the athlete. And number 3 is actually using your pinky to have the coach feel how the archer's using their thumb. These are 2 methods that work very, very well. My main suggestion is obviously to try various methods with the archer. So we talked a little bit in the last slide about index finger relaxation, pinky, ring finger, tension. You will find the athlete will benefit from one over another, but it can also change how their bow aims. So be very mindful of the stabilizer weight and the power and the scope. There are a few factors to manage there. So in the end, the release is probably one of the most critical instance. Obviously, the whole section is called critical instance in shooting a compound bow, and it's an area that is a big difference from compound to recurve, in that a lot of time will be spent with this in an intermediate level athlete, with a high level athlete as well, so an international level athlete. And to that point, the intermediate level athlete. So at the beginning, we talked about engaging with beginners. So that is having less people, the bow takes time to set up, that you're looking at more of the preparatory body positioning. With that athlete continuing on, we're talking now more of the club level to national championship sort of attendee. What you'll find, and a big difference from the recurve to the compound, is that they're scoring a lot earlier. So the recurve bow is typically seen as more challenging to get technically and build up strength and their body awareness, where compound, which has that greater spectrum, allows for the athlete to be shooting at a target a lot earlier. And also, I think that sort of melds in well with it being a very aiming focused side of archery. So typically you'll see archers advancing into that scoring, into shooting at target places a lot earlier. And it can be as early as, weeks into using a compound bow, days of trying a bow and shooting at targets quite effectively if they can manage the peep and the release and everything else. So typically you'll see the recurve is taking years of proficiency to getting to that, technical sort of focus, where the compound, it can be months and weeks. There is a greater focus on that release control. I think I just mentioned that. Here you can continue to work on body posture, this technical skills, so they understand and explore what's best for them. Obviously, if they're a developing athlete, they'll be growing perhaps, and if young teenagers, but customizing this to match them and their flexibility, their sort of range of motion with their shoulders, their ability to, hold their position. This is something that, as a coach in this intermediate level, I think you'll have a lot more exploration around their body technique, but it'll be higher focus towards the sort of aiming and execution side of the release aid. Another thing in terms of physical, so you have, we've talked a lot about technical work here today, but there's also the mental and the physical and your equipment and your training that you need to consider. And in this intermediate phase, I do like to try and engage more around some strength and conditioning, which I think is critical to the development of these athletes. And some fitness can sort of come in here. And you will find they're sort of moving into the more advanced bows. And there's a lot of time that you will spend on, say, equipment tuning and preparation for these athletes. But we'll cover that in subsequent slides in this presentation. So the final section of World Archery's technique, or steps, four major steps, is the follow through and breathing. I don't want to talk about that too much at all. You can see me here shooting with a rather interesting follow through. All I can say is I'm looking for the same type of things with the recurve as I am with the compound, and that is that you maintain the sort of tension and direction that you were holding at full draw. Obviously, with my picture here, I didn't do a good job of that, but the arrow is coming out of that bow very fast. So actually, as you follow through with the compound, because the arrow is leaving so quickly, the follow through can be a little bit shorter than the recurve, and that's totally effective as well. One of the things I do like to look for in the follow through is to use it as a tool in terms of a coach and filming the archers, and that is it can show you as a coach what they're doing with their body, how they're focusing on either that front side pressure, backside pulling, whether they're looking for their arrow if they move their head. And that's the same with the recurve as it is with the compound for me. I like to look at the follow through as a prescription in terms of what they've been doing poorly perhaps with their technique, as well as what they've been doing well. So, moving on to the more advanced level athletes. This is a national team member and above. These are those that are shooting, say, World Cups and professionally around the world, there are very few professional team structures that exist around the world. That's just the nature of the compound sport, unfortunately. Hopefully that will continue to improve. There are some archers around the world that are getting support. Typically that means there's very little funding and support services for these athletes. And as we discussed in the beginning of this presentation, there are less presentations, there are less information that you can find from organizations around compound, but it is improving and getting better. You'll find that these athletes are often self-funded, heavily driven, passionate about the sport. And what you find around the compound, and I think this is very recurve centric as well, or similar to the recurve, is that they're often very comfortable with sharing their information with the other archers. I found in general, compounders are a lot more open to sharing what they're up to than the recurvers are, even though some recurvers will do that quite well. And that is, I think, because of the fact that there's not much funding, there's very little professionalism with the compound, and there isn't much information. So compounds seem a little more open to sharing that. What you do find if you're working with an international level compound archer is you have to deal with their work and their, say, study or their personal life a lot more. Their archery sort of gets melded around that because, again, not many of them are professional, and there's less hours for them to train. What you do find, though, with that situation is that typically these guys don't have a lot of wasted arrows. Their volumes might be lower, but their focus and what they do in those sessions is very, very planned and targeted. So that's a bit of a difference. I think I've mentioned here that, there's the number of arrows that a compounder will shoot could be as little as 200 to 300 in a week, and that can be incredibly effective if that's a quality training session. But I have seen compounders that reached up into the sort of 2,000 plus per week. So you do see a lot more variety with that. In the recurve world, you do not see a lot of archers at a high international level that aren't, say, outputting about 1,000 hours a week as a minimum. So, 5 days a week, 200 hours a day type scenario. And that's a huge difference from the compound to the recurve realm. One of the things that you'll find is that, I'm generalizing here, but the focus and attention seems a lot more with the compounders, especially with the nature of the sport, which is you cannot miss. You must shoot 7, 10 almost to be competitive. Even in the women, 700 now is a score that is done by quite a few women. So for me, the psychological focus and the ability to deal with those kinds of stresses seems a little bit higher. Also, the big difference with bending and release control, there is a lot of, and I mean a lot of focus at the highest level, this advanced level around release control and aiming. And they must be very, very good, obviously, to get that high score at that 710 sort of level or 700 plus level. From a fitness side of things, you'll find a lot more maintenance going on, not so much building. But there are a few archers out there that Demogorge Budin, Stefan Hansen, that are getting a lot more physical, and it's for the benefit of them and for the benefit of the sport. And I think you'll see more of that as you see a higher professionalization in the compound world. It is, I think, a big difference from the recurve and the compound is that obviously they have better structures in place usually because of the Olympics, but you'll see a lot more focus on strength and conditioning with the recurvers than you will with the compounders. But I think you'll see a lot more of that growing in the compound, and I hope that occurs in the future because it will help the sport and then push it to another level. Now, we've looked pretty heavily in this seminar so far at, say, the technical aspects. For me, it's very interesting and it covers a wide range of, obviously, levels, beginner, intermediate, advanced. I do want to touch on the differences in equipment between the recurve and compound, but I don't want to touch on it very much. For me, it's something that is the most focused area that you'll find in most seminars around the world. And I have, I think, a very simple approach to equipment around the compound bow and the recurve that I actually find it quite useful at the high level, the international advanced level, but it's more interesting in the intermediate and beginner level. And that is, I like a simple equipment setup. So I have the same focus for both recurve and compound. And this is where a lot of people, because compound typically is seen as more of a technical side to archery, there's a lot more equipment coming out, there's a lot more brands and availability, and that leads to a lot of questions and a lot of tinkering perhaps. And I'm sure some of the coaches that are on this seminar today will have a wide variety of skills with compound equipment. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have anything specific. I'm going to really move through it quite quickly, but just know that I look for the same type of simple setups with my recurve and compound, and I focus more on the actual skill of shooting, the mental side of shooting, and the training plans than I do, say, the equipment side of things. So here, quickly, I know it's a lot of words on this slide, but this is my simple setup for a compound bow as well as a recurve bow. And I think if you, as a recurve coach, that might not feel so happy or that might not feel so comfortable working with a compound bow, this can be quite helpful because it's not that difficult once you learn how to set this sort of information up, or these bows up, because they are a very simple machine. And vice versa, the compound archer coaches who typically look at the recurve and think that it's kind of voodoo magic perhaps, and it's a lot more airy-fairy, they're not sure exactly what it should be at. It's not that difficult to do either. So with the compound, even tillers, cams timed, the cam in space being relatively straight, an arrow set centrally, the sight set squarely, and using a very simple sort of scope, 4 to 6 power, is enough. Plain and simple, very, very easy. With the recurve, I have the same type of approach, and I call it getting a bow to spec, meaning even with the compound, I call it getting the bow into spec, which is basically what the manufacturer suggests the bow should be set at. And that is, with the recurve, the tiller should be 2 to 5 millimeters, 2 to 7 millimeters in the positive side, the limbs aligned straightly, the brace height set at the manufacturer's specifications, the arrow set centrally in the middle of the bow, so laterally, the nocking height slightly above square, and the sight straight and level. This is the same sort of approach I have. You can obviously individualize this equipment for every archer. You have different sizes, strengths, flexibility ranges, and they must be done. But initially, at that beginning and intermediate level, this kind of setup can be highly effective. And in fact, where I have bows that I have to really set out of whack or out of spec to be effective, typically I'll find myself going back to this type of method with more advanced archers, purely because you shouldn't have to do that with a compound too much. If it's out of spec or out of line by a dramatic amount, there typically is some other great problem that you're potentially missing. In terms of some of the other stuff with these, the compounds, the stabilizer setups, and the arrow setups, I try and do the exact same for both. The stabilizers with the compound is a little bit more interesting around the stabilizer weight. I'm much for a simpler, lighter setup than I am for a heavier setup. That typically is something that is a bit more interesting in today's compound world. Even the recurvers are starting to get more weights on their stabilizers. My suggestion is to start with just good ratios, so either a 1:2 or 1:4 front to back. So you have 2 weights at the front, have 4 weights at the back, 1:2. But there are plenty of archers out there now that are actually having reverse ratios or same ratios, meaning the same amount of weights at the front and the back, or they're having more weight at the front than they are at the back. And that will really be determined by their activation style, how aggressive, assertive they are at using their release aids or activating that release. It could also depend on how they hold their body as well. So for me, the arrows, spine charts, selecting, I just go with exactly what the manufacturer suggests. I don't do much in terms of spine testing and grain weighing. I think the good manufacturers now out there have amazing equipment, and you don't have to tinker too much, especially with the beginner and intermediate level. But you will find yourself when you reach the more advanced levels or towards the end of the intermediate level that you'll find a lot more focus on this. But again, it's not really my concern for today's seminar. In terms of compound, the differences with recurve and compound for equipment for tuning, there are some differences that you obviously you will need. And that is pretty simple here, is that you need a bow press, or at least access to a bow press. I have one myself. Typically, you should be engaging with a local store. For me, that's a really important thing, is to speak with a local store that has some skill in using compound bows. There's typically a good amount of skill out there. You will need pliers. D-lip pliers can be purchased for making their D-lips, but pliers will work for that as well. Typically, Allen keys. A paper tuning device can be highly effective and necessary. Here you'll see the Indian national team archers at the Asian Games having a rather interesting take on paper tuner. I wouldn't suggest this method. Be very careful. Obviously standing in front of someone with a loaded bow, but actually these guys won a couple of big medals at that event, and that was effective for them to test that bow. Other things you'll need is a bow vise. So you can see on the image on the right-hand side, typically for setting up your sight levels, it's great to have one of these, but it can also be really good for your arrow through center and its position in space to use a bow vise. And to that, you'll need some levels, obviously. So to go on the bow, to go on the sights, to make sure things are nice and straight and square. But in general, this is all I think you really need for a compound. It doesn't have to be too complex. It is an area that is covered, I think, too much in most cases. Now, I do want to quickly touch on tuning methods. You can see here the archers from the Chinese Taipei national team in the image pressing a bow on the field. This is something that I did want to make sure they felt comfortable with doing. But for me, the actual tuning process is a very simple process. I don't try and make it too complicated, especially again at the beginner intermediate level. As I move up into the national team level, we will use a lot more types of tuning. But I do think that a simpler method is the way to go. So my method here, you can see that with the compound paper tuning, I do that from two positions. Typically that's one from relatively up close to the paper, one from further back to see how the arrow is initially traveling out of the bow. I will use a sort of a walk back or French tune method to check my center shot, my arrow rest positioning. And then only if I have issues will I use other. So that's if I'm seeing a lot of vertical issues in my arrows, or the arrow is not coming out, say, nice and straight, I'll use a draw board to see if there's any sort of movement of my nock travel as I'm drawing that back. And that's a bit of a timing issue with your bow usually that you can use creep tuning methods on. Torque tuning is something I really don't do too much of. I do that if there's some arrow width problems, meaning the archer's shooting well in terms of how they're using their body, but finding a lot of arrow width left and right. And I'll typically only use my rest for those positions, but you can use your sights, and that can be quite effective. And bear shafting, I honestly, personally don't use. I have used it on some of the high-level athletes around the world, but I don't believe it is effective as a tool for compound tuning. Now, that might be a bit contentious because you see quite a few archers around the world, and I'm interested in your thoughts on that in the question and answer section later on. But personally, I don't use that method. And for those that don't know, it's typically about trying to find the spine of your arrow and looking to see where that bear shaft lands. And in fact, that's exactly how I'll tune my bow with the recurve, which is after my simple setup, bear shafting at 18 meters, moving back to 30 meters. Very rarely will I do it further than that. And I'll use the actual group at 70 meters if I'm shooting with a recurve archer to determine some of the smaller adjustments, more personalized adjustments as we move along. So that's literally my sort of information on compound equipment, a little bit on tuning. Again, I don't want to touch on it too much because I think it's touched on way too much. And if you have any questions, we can ask. You can ask those at the end of the seminar. So Moving on to training plans, which is actually, I think, the most interesting section of the seminar today. And that is purely because I think it's the greatest area for growth in compound. I think compound is more mentally challenging. I think I've said that before. Typically, that's because you need to be comfortable, you need to be happy with shooting against the highest guys in the world who aren't missing on a very regular basis, so that shooting 10s almost all the time. Indoor score now is perfect, and multiple people have shot that. World record is 718. The young man who was, World Championship silver was also the World Youth Championship gold. So the level is very, very high. Sierra Lopez shooting perfect scores, and Tanya Jensen and others, the Korean women shooting incredibly well. I think you have to be very mentally prepared. And for me, the training plan is somewhat the glue that connects all of the areas that you're working on. So that might be your technical, your mental, your physical, your equipment. And then this training plan section is this last piece that connects all four of those together and gets you testing and trying, some of your plans, some of your goals. And for me, it's something that I really enjoy doing, adding variety, helping with concentration, because that's an important area to sort of work on for a compound athlete and a recurve. But typically, for me, when I went to Chinese Taipei, it was the biggest issue that I changed when I went there. There was a lot more of the Eastern mentality or Asian mentality around volume. They also were able to train a lot more, so there was a lot more arrows being shot. I was really looking for the quality of arrows rather than the quantity. So for me, you can see here the images is one of our whiteboards at the range that we used to use. We had some images of the top sort of 15 and 20 athletes in the world, some of their specifications, and we were literally trying to plan to try and exchange athletes out of that and putting in Chinese Taipei athletes into those positions. So the planning of that is I think the most interesting, and I think it's the biggest area we can see growth in the compound bow. So moving along, in terms of writing plans and creating plans, some people are a little bit cautious, scared of doing this. For me, it's a sort of a KISS method, and that is you don't have to really do too much complexity. Keeping it simple is a great way to look at this. And in fact, the images in this slide are of some of my actual, my yearly plan and my weekly plan, some of my weekly plans that you would have seen for the national team of Taiwan. The top one is the annual plan that it sort of highlighted the annual year, had a couple of blocks here, what we were focusing on in each of the blocks, some of the goals we were looking for in terms of what we were looking to achieve, looking at some of the areas of help we needed. So, looking at where we could improve just as an organization, as a squad. And from that, I'm able to then create weekly training plans. So some of the things you have to do is obviously look at the annual calendar. What is your main events? Understand the goals of the athlete, understand the goals of the program. This is very similar to recurve. This is not anything different that I would really do from one to the other. The one thing that I will differ greatly between the recurve and compound here is the amount of scoring that's being done and the types of drills that are being done. Typically, the drills are a lot more around dealing with pressure, understanding shot sequences and scoring, so aiming skills, than it will be with recurves, which will be a lot more rhythm, technique focused. So you have to obviously balance all of the information you have when they go to the gym, when work might happen, physiotherapy, other sort of key areas that you can't really miss, and then work around that. I like to do it in blocks, 2 to 3 months, and then each one of those blocks, create weekly plans for each one of those. Some of them might go across multiple weeks, some of them might be just for singular weeks, depends on the group you've already got. And then make sure you reassess. I won't really go past creating weekly plans for, say, more than one block, purely because so much can change in that block that you might, if you do plans for the whole year, weekly plans for the whole year, it might be a bit of a waste of time, might not use them very much. And there's a little point down the bottom there, which is the more you have athletes of a high level, so of the same level, this can be a lot easier to do. But actually, what I think the majority of the nations and the coaches that are on this seminar today is that you will have to deal with an interesting group or a spectrum of higher performing through to, say, national performing athletes, which can be a great variety. So when that happens, your ability to create a plan that both engages the high performance and improves the, say, more national level athletes becomes quite the skill. And no different to other forms of coaching, you must practice and practice as much as you can at doing this and gain feedback from your athletes about what worked, what didn't work, and then use that in subsequent blocks to then, bring out the outcomes you're looking for. So in the weekly training plans, drills, and skills, I use these a lot. You can see an image here of some of the Chinese Taipei archers shooting from the chair. I would add a lot of interesting sort of left field sort of drills for them to do. Also a lot of standard ones that you most likely are already doing yourself. These can really help, the athlete understand themselves, the process, the strategies, what would they do in this situation? And for me, it's understanding a little bit some of their personal goals, and this is where the plan can be different for one athlete in the group to another. So this is where you can have a high-level athlete and have a somewhat plan that matches up with others in the group, or have it totally separate as well. It can be very difficult to simulate the stress that occurs at a world-level event. And these drills are attempting to look for specific skills or focus points that might come at them. It is very difficult to actually simulate or emulate that highest level competition. So for me, that's why that variety is important. That's why I want to make sure that they're not getting used to one. And the big thing I'm looking for from these types of drills typically is that when they go to a world level event, there's not many scenarios they haven't already faced. So I don't like an athlete coming to me saying, I've never had that before. I've never had to shoot my last arrow in front of everyone before. I've never had to change my release aid, in the middle of a match. And these kinds of things are where the drills and the planning can be quite helpful for you. I do mention that, even 100 hours a week, 3 to 5 days a week, can be incredibly helpful for a compounder. For a recurve, I don't think as much, but still quantity or quality is important. So you might find that depending on the level of the recurve archer, that they could get away with, say, 500 arrows in maybe an off season, or even when they're not shooting, that's fine too. But in season, getting towards a tournament, for a compounder, 3 to 500 can still be effective. So, training plans continued, the drills, the games, some of the variables that you can change, you already know of them, and there's no doubt that archery coaches on this call, if you haven't done any compound coaching before, there's no doubt you're using drills already. I'm keen to learn more myself, so the more I know, the more I can adapt and give them to compounders as well. But there's no doubt you're already doing some of this, even if you're not a compound coach. And there's a few factors that you can vary that can actually cause and create some of these simulations that you're looking for. Obviously, the number of arrows you're shooting in end can be really good. The higher the volume in that, the more fatigue you can sort of elicit in the archer. 9 arrows, 10 arrows, 12 arrows, especially in a phase when you're earlier in the year, not typically towards the end of the year, unless the tournament structure is a one that requires the athlete to be in the field for a long time. The lower the number, the more you're trying to get the good score, the stress management, the competition readiness out of the athlete. So this is where you're shooting matches, you're shooting single arrow shoot-offs, trying to get those scenarios in. Timing obviously is one you can change, longer, shorter time frames. I like the shorter one for stress, trying to give less time to the archer. It can elicit some quite good physical type situations, breathing, heart rate, and some shaking. So Be very mindful of going too fast, obviously. The distance is one you manipulate a lot, how far the target away is, the size of the target face. These are all good tools to really help the athletes. Now you'll see some images of myself here and some of the archers in Taiwan when we were preparing for, I think that's the year of the World University Games. And I actually partake in some of these games. For me, it's really important to actually put myself in those simulations. It's part of my background that I really use to my advantage, is understanding what they would feel like under those scenarios. And then obviously, directing them where I can. And so I've got some matches here with the archers and had some fun with them. For me, it's really important that I think coaches get involved more with the athletes and the drills that they're doing to understand. So where you can, get involved and try some of these games out with them. You don't have to do them all the time, but at least understand them would be great. The final one that really is different for compound around training plans is aiming. This is, again, I mentioned that before, that aiming is a very big skill for compound that people are really trying to grow in compound in terms of their ability to aim in the middle all the time. This is something you don't see so much with the recurve bow, and it's probably the biggest difference in the training plans and these variables. And as I mentioned before, the other difference would be the volume or percentage of scoring. The compound is much higher. In fact, on a international sort of level, I'm sort of putting probably 90 to 85% of their volume of shooting arrows per week into scoring versus a recurver, which might only be, 60 to 70% when they're close to a competition. So that's the big difference, that aiming portion and then that volume of scoring for a compounder. Now, I've put a lot of things in this slide, but basically these are some of the drills and games you can play. You'll actually note some images on the side here of the archers, playing some games from the national teams that I've been in. In fact, we used the video game quite a bit for some fun in Taiwan, but this gives you a whole raft of types of games you can play that are, in my mind, very specific towards or more focused towards the compound bow. Team movements with the compound can be a little trickier. Obviously, they have to put the legs on. They can't have that on when they go on the line anymore. So 20 seconds is hard for recurve, but I think it's actually harder for compound because typically their shot cycle, their shot sequence is longer. Aiming off skills is something that I really, really need for a compound. The ability to know how much your sight needs to move from one ring to the other is critical. In the compound world now, being that a match is the won and lost typically in final arrows, the person who can adapt and find their sight quickly can be the winner. It typically is the winner. So an archer who hits an 8 to the right on their first shot, that knows they have made a good shot, can move their sight effectively, that's what that aiming off game there is in the top. Now, I don't want to go through all of these. We can, if you see one of these while we're talking now, that you're like, I'm interested to know, what is that aiming drill that you're doing? What sort of variables would you do? What distance, what size target face? Please ask in the question and answers. Very interested to know more about some games that you might have that I can use that might not be here. But in general, we're looking at aiming, timing, and size of target face variations. You also note there's some single arrow shoot-offs, which is something that dealing with this pressure, giving them some sort of sequence or some sort of issue to change, their release aids or whatever. These can be very, very effective in gaining some improvement in your athletes. So when they get to a tournament, what they can't tell you or they won't tell you, they've never had that before. So I guess in the end, we're all finished now. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate you all listening to me. I'm really interested in actually hearing from you now. I did try and cover a few areas, and that was the beginner, intermediate, more advanced level, and how that differs between the recurve and compound. I also was looking at that shot technique pretty heavily. We did cover a little bit of equipment and then some training plans as well. So again, I appreciate your time. I want to thank Pascal and Tom for allowing me to do this. And I'm just looking forward to any of your questions in the next section. So thank you.
Well, thanks for that, Robert. Don't forget, if you've got a question for Robert or any of our other speakers today, you can send them to info@archery.sport or send them on Twitter using the hashtag Archery Coaching Seminar. We'll be taking a short break now before continuing with a presentation on technology for data-driven coaching. Welcome back. And well, as this online seminar proves, we live in a connected world and data is all around us. Archery coaching, of course, is going high tech too, if you know how to use it properly. These next two presentations from the creators of the Mantis X8, which tracks aiming movement, and Artemis, the world-leading archery analysis platform, aim to teach us just that.
Good morning. My name is Austin Allgaier from Mantis. I'm excited and privileged to be speaking with you today to talk about the fascinating capabilities and possibilities that data and technology can really bring to enhance our archery performance and our coaching performance within that field. I'm one of the founders of Mantis. We develop shooting performance systems that collect and analyze all sorts of data. I'm an engineer by background, and I have a whole team of engineers that love looking at data, that love the shooting sports, and love helping shooters improve. So with that, I'd like to jump into the presentation and talk about some insights we've gained, some products we developed to help you perform better as a coach and as athletes. So here we go. So data-driven approaches and insights to improve coaching and training. Our mission is to help every single shooter improve. And we can do that by helping shooters directly improve, as well as help coaches improve their performance as well. So what we've done as part of our vision is we've latched onto what we believe is a fundamental truth, and that is when performance is measured, performance improves. That applies to a broad swath of life in general, and particularly to sports, and particularly to the shooting sports. And we believe also that technology helps us unlock powerful insights that we've never had before, because it can see beyond our human limitations and see things that we can't even perhaps imagine could be seen. So company background, Mantis has been around for about 6 years now. We've been doing high-tech motion analytics for the shooting sports since 2014. We started off in the firearm space with handguns, then created variants for rifles and then shotguns, then recently got into the archery space by request and by personal interest as well. So one of our processes that we go through is to develop a new product that does motion analytics. Is we collect data from some of the best shooters in the world. And then we collect data from everyone else, myself, our team, and lots of others in the discipline, new shooters, advanced shooters, intermediate shooters, and everything in between. And then we hand it over to our engineers who have remarkable capabilities with machine learning, neural nets, artificial intelligence, and they build software tools to help us understand the difference between what makes a good shooter great and where we are at, and then how we can help close that gap. And then we iterate quickly on user feedback to constantly add more value to the process. So this is an overview of the product that we have available for archery currently. It's a small, lightweight Bluetooth motion tracker that mounts to a bow with an included adapter. And what it does is it tracks thousands of data points per second and sends all that information back to a smartphone or tablet. It pairs with an app and gives you real-time feedback on your shooting mechanics. There's an image there showing the size. It weighs 15 grams, I believe. Small, lightweight, non-obtrusive, does not impact the shooting experience at all. So a few key features of what this technology enables us to do. And this technology is not new per se. It's new to archery, but it's widely used in a broad swath of sports. So what we do in the archery space specifically is that we capture the movement trace throughout the entire shot process. On the right is a screenshot of one of the screens of the app that shows you before, during, and after the shot, the entire movement of the archer, or the archer's bow, I should say, as it's mounted on the bow. It gives you a detailed breakdown of the entire shooting process, and then it provides lots of data and analytics and useful feedback to help you understand what's going on throughout the entire shot process. If you look up here in the right-hand corner, where my mouse is, it gives a stability score, and that score is based off of how much movement happens just prior to the shot. We'll talk about that a little bit more later in terms of how it's used. You can see here, this is the setup. Setup, and then bring it into the hold. The release is the white X, and then when the bow leaves, or when the arrow leaves the bow, is the red X, and the red is the follow through. This is not a very good shooter per se. We'll talk about how we can tell that later on as well. But given a highlight of shot timing as well, here's where the shot starts, here's where it ends, how long the shot takes, and here's all the movement that happens in between. So another key component of that is that the trace breaks it down into different phases. On this previous slide here, you can see the color code according to different phases, according to the NTS that we use here in the United States and is used other places as well. And you are allowed to then, once you break it into different phases, you're allowed to compare your performance within those phases. So in this particular case, you can see this is the hold and release phase. The yellow coming down into the shot. You can see the gray lines are previous shots. So you can see how consistent that shot is in comparison with other shots. And then the release. Again, we'll talk about this in more detail in just a moment. But you can see also the movement along different axes and how sporadic or how consistent it is as you're moving through the shot. There's a lot of granular details you can get out of this, so it's really designed for anywhere from a beginning to an advanced shooter. You can tune as broadly or as finely as you want to. Another component of the analysis that we do is, since we capture time-based things, we can analyze the time of each phase of that shot. Again, looking for outliers, looking to quantify improvement, looking at granular details, looking at, again, consistency between shots. In this particular shot, you can see the fifth, this orange section correlates to the orange section, which is the hold time just before the shot is released. The last shot held about 3 seconds longer than average. Whereas in the third shot, you can see that just prior to that, he stayed a little bit longer in the window of time just prior to the hold. So it took him a little longer to get on target, but this time he held it on target for longer. So another data point to help you understand, was that shot better or worse? And maybe this is a little key as to helping us understand why it was better or worse. One of the key features is that it helps isolate the mechanics of the shooter from the actual shot on target. It helps you identify exactly where the issue truly is, rather than just looking at that single point of where the arrow landed. How we view that is that where the arrow lands is kind of like the last page of a book, and Mantis tells you kind of the whole story. Here's a couple additional features of data points that the Mantis X8 unit provides. It allows shot placement to allow you to actually manually add where the shot landed on the target, and then it'll overlay the trace of the movement on top of that, depending on the distance to the target and the size of the target. It also provides pitch and cant data. So you, again, look for inconsistencies, look for consistencies, look for outliers. It also provides the ability with internet connectivity to then share that data with a coach, with a peer, with other people, so you can have insights that you couldn't otherwise gain on yourself. So as a coach, you can monitor individual and group progress from any device. You can be remote, and then you can get the same amount of data as if you were there in person. You don't have the visual of watching them shoot, but you have the data captured there to analyze what actually happened. It also tracks your history, keeps that all in a large record on the phone or on the smartphone or tablet, as well as stores it in the cloud if you choose to. So you can track progress over the time, you can filter and search, and you can really evaluate your progress. So I want to talk through a few instances of how this could be used in a coaching environment. So here's a couple traces that were collected from 2 different shooters. I'm going to highlight a couple things that we can glean from the data here. So you can see that they do have similar movement traces. They both come up, they come down, they release, and then there's the follow through. Looking at this one on the left, you can see that coming up, they're pretty smooth. Coming down, they're a bit shaky. This one, when it comes up, pretty smooth. And when they're coming down, they're a little bit shaky, but not quite as shaky as this. What we found out in this particular shooter was that the draw length was too high. That's why they were shaking. They didn't have the muscle support to enable them to have that nice, smooth control throughout the entire shot process. We can also see during the release of the arrow is right here in the white X, and when it leaves the bow is on the red X. So we can see that there is movement from between the release and when the arrow leaves the bow, which indicates that there is expanding. If this was a left-handed shooter, they expanded through the release, or if it was a right-handed shooter, they contracted through the release. So that bow moved slightly during that release process. So you can see that similar thing happened with this shooter here. We'll see some good examples in a moment. Another interesting thing to point out is that this shooter came down below their aim point, and then they came up right before the release, which is typically not the desired shooting mechanic. This shooter did a similar thing, but not quite to the same extent, so slightly improved there. So you can see all sorts of little things in the data that you can tune the bow as well as tune the shooter to this. In general, you can also see this example is about bow tuning, and I mentioned some other things there. You can see that the hold pattern just prior to the shot is not quite as stable as you'd like it to see, which means that maybe some stabilizer adjustments need to be made. And as you make stabilizer adjustments, this score in the upper right-hand corner that shows the stability score, that will change. So you can know if you have too much, too little, and just find the right amount there. This is another, talking about the release. I alluded to this on the previous slide a little bit. This example here shows a nice clean release where those X's are very close to each other. Whereas this one, like we talked about, this is the example from the previous slide, they released or they expanded or contracted through the shot, depending on what handedness the shooter is. You can also see this shooter is much smoother, much more controlled through that release. And also their follow through is much cleaner. This follow through, you see that they go upwards, whereas this follow through, you see they let it fall as we would expect and hope it would occur in a more proficient shooter. Again, indicators to coaches as to A, is the shooter listening to what I'm telling them, and B, is it effective? As well as an indicator directly to the shooter for them to help self-diagnose when they may not have a coach available to watch them as they make micro changes and look at the results to validate or invalidate the success of that change. Here's another example. When you have a lot of shot data, you can start looking at consistency issues. So one of the keys, obviously, to proficient shooting is consistency, not just competency on a single shot, but competency across lots of shots. In this instance here, very good shooter, very smooth, very strong, bringing into the shot, and you can see the gray lines. This is shot 5 out of their 6 shots stored in this particular session. The other 5 shots are grayed out. The current shot 5 is highlighted here in color, so you can see how that one shot compared to all the others throughout the entire movement trace. You can see here, this one's not selected, but that bottom gray one is ever so different. It's not, it's further away. They didn't bring the bow up quite as high, and it's a little bit shakier. Again, this is a top tier shooter, so it's very high quality, but this top tier shooter is looking for any little small micro edge that they might be able to make. And so coming into that, this is the first part of the shot, the first few phases. As you come into the final couple phases, you can see that coming down is pretty consistent. A lot of overlapping lines, which is good from a consistency perspective. You can see this particular shot, that gray one, they came down a little bit lower than the others. And then there's 1 or 2 shots that came out a little bit to the left-hand side before they brought it down. This particular shooter likes to kind of come across a little bit rather than bringing it down. Now they may want to change their technique, and they can analyze it accordingly. So again, useful for looking at multiple shots all together rather than just an isolated shot. So those are just a few examples. There are many, many, many examples that I could talk to, but what kind of our core thesis is that data and technology unlock so much more. So really the question is what new questions can we now explore that maybe we couldn't explore before? A few of these is, how do we tune the bow beyond just how it feels? We want to know if it actually makes a quantitative difference in their stability. We can measure that now. How do we tune the shooter beyond just feel? We can say that shot felt strong or it felt right, but did they actually shoot correctly? Did they shoot right? How do we evaluate the effectiveness of a weight training program? How does that impact their smoothness, their consistency? Does the coaching feedback I gave make a difference? So we can track that progress and that history over time. It's all logged, and we can make notes within the sessions to say, I did this differently, I did that differently, and we can evaluate quantitatively the impact that each of those changes made. Obviously, one of the key questions right now is, how can I more effectively coach with coronavirus restrictions or remote athletes? Well, this is all cloud driven. All the data can be stored in the cloud, and with that, it opens and unlocks possibilities to really scale the coaching capabilities with current restrictions we have in place, as well as the remoteness of everything. Lots of questions we can ask ourselves. I'm going to throw a few more out there. What more questions can we now explore? So are there particular movement patterns that give leading indicators of potential injury? So are there things we can see in the data that would tell us that something is getting weaker and potentially on the verge of injury before the athlete starts to feel something? if there's an outlier, what was different about that one shot that was different than the others? What can I filter out as not part of that shot? What can I say was for sure one of the contributing factors, and what can I say was not one of the contributing factors? Mantis helps you isolate those particular issues. You can identify, as an example, was it the shooter or the wind? Were there weather conditions at play? Were the shooter mechanics strong and just got a bad burst of wind, or was something else attributable to the erroneous shot? You can say what specific phase of the shot was different. So we look holistically, but we also look at the very granular phases to really hone in and isolate the specific areas of true need. And obviously one of the key questions is we have the greatest coaches in the world want to be able to scale their capability to reach more athletes and to help elevate the entire archery game. And so we're trying to use technology and data to really scale the coaching abilities with limited resources, be it time, be it travel, be it money. And technology can really unlock a lot of those opportunities for us. So kind of closing with a little bit of a mission statement, our hope is that we can all let technology and data open doors to ask and answer questions that we have never considered until now. And it's our hope that we can use technology and data that Mantis provides, that other solution providers have put onto the market as well, to really achieve the goal that we all have, and that's to help every shooter improve. Thank you for your time.
Hello, nice of you to join my presentation on Artemis. Artemis is an app, an archery performance tracking app. And before we go into the app, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Marcel van Apeldoorn. I am, in my professional career, I am a research and development engineer, and my research focuses on air traffic control software and air traffic control systems, and the human factors and training aspects in air traffic control systems. But some of you might know me as a coach. Currently I'm the head coach of the compound team of the Netherlands. I joined the coaching staff in 2011, and since 2017 I'm also a member of the World Archery Coaching Committee. This presentation on Artemis is obviously about performance tracking, so I'd like to go into performance tracking just a little bit, and then show you the app and how to use it. And then I'd like to show some features which I really like, features like the site advice or the Dare to Dream features. I'll talk a bit about a metric called the Archer Skill Level, which is a metric which measures the skill level of an archer, and why we need this metric. Then we go into a small example on how to use Artemis as an analysis tool, how to use it for sharing data between athlete and coaches, and then some final thoughts and obviously some questions. Okay, let's start with performance tracking and why do we need it. I think currently all top athletes in any sports are working as hard as they can. There's no way that you can gain any advantage to the opposition by practicing more hours in a day, because everybody is practicing the maximum amount of hours in a day. So work harder does not apply anymore. I think currently we have to find ways in working smarter. And one of the ways in you can work smarter is by making sure that everything you do is effective. And the only way to do that is by analyzing what you're doing. So what we are as coaches normally do is we go out and we create a training program for our athletes, and that includes goal setting and well, everything that we already do as a coach. Our athletes then practice and execute those training programs. But what we sometimes fail to do is to reflect on the results of those training programs and analyze those results, and when needed, adapt the training programs. And I think Artemis is a tool that might be able to help with that. Artemis is a mobile app, so it runs on mobile devices. There are many different apps that run on mobile devices that can keep track of score and also keep track of plotting, but there are not that many that can also do the analysis and also the sharing of data that Artemis can. Its development started in 2011, and many top archers, recurve archers, compound archers, and also coaches have been involved in its development. And since 2013, we've used it in major worldwide competitions for tracking performances, for analyzing grouping patterns, etc. It runs on Android devices only, so there's no iOS version, unfortunately, but Android devices are not really expensive, and the light version of Artemis is free to try out, and upgrades are around $10 US. Okay, let's give a small tour of the app itself. So if you start up Artemis, this is an emulator, so it emulates what you will see on the mobile device. And Artemis is divided into 5 domains. So we have the coach domain, we have the archer domain, we have the setup domain, we have the record domain, and we have the analysis domain. And if we start all the way on the left, the coach domain, if you are a coach and you are coaching different athletes, you'd like to switch between different athletes pretty easy, so you can just call up your list of athletes and then select the athletes you want to switch to see their data. And you can edit some of the self-reflection questions that is a part of Artemis as well, which I will talk about later. If we look at the archer domain, this is the domain of the archer itself. Archers can look at their personal bests that they did. They can look at a calendar which will give them some information on when did they practice. So the green blocks are practice sessions, the red blocks are competition sessions. So this is just a small calendar. There's a diary function as well. So if an archer changes, for example, their technical form, they want to make an entry in a diary, they can have like diary sessions here. And later on as a coach, you can also analyze like their skill level before and after some kind of form change. If you look at setup, if you are going to record information, so plot arrows or record your scoring or whatever, you always do that with some kind of bow setup. And if you don't know which setup you used, well, you can record what you like, but you will never be able to analyze it to the fullest because you don't know which tuning or which bow setup you used. So you have to add some information in Artemis, like what kind of sight are you using or what kind of bow are you using. So you have a couple of bows here. What kind of arrow sets do you use? Your new sets or your older sets or whatever. There's different arrow sets here, and they all like come together in the bow setup. So you have setups that you've used in the different years and different indoor seasons or outdoor seasons, and you can actually put a lot of information in this setup. So which bow sight did you use, which bow did you use, the draw weight, brace height, anything. So anything that you like to add to your or change in your setup, make an entry over here, because later on if you try to analyze the information, you still know which setup you've used when you're analyzing the information. Now we have the record domain. In the record domain, athletes can keep their sight settings for each setup that they have. There's an archery timer here if you like to practice with counting down or with timing or whatever. But the main 2 features are entering rounds and entering sessions. So if we look at rounds, an archer can create different rounds. So this is a list of rounds that the archer shot, and this is a list of the individual sessions that are in a round So a 70-meter round, for example, consists of 2 sessions of 36 arrows at 70 meters. But also practice sessions, like we see here in green, practice sessions on a blank bale, or practice sessions indoor. Competition sessions are in red. So this is actually the diary of an archer shooting a lot of practice and competition. And this is where the archer will store like all its data. And then the final domain is the analysis domain. If you have captured all that data, you can do the analysis on it. You can do analysis in a graph. So these are usually line-oriented graphs where you can see the archer's performance in time. For example, the skill level of the archer in time, or average score on a certain target phase, or the volume of arrows that an archer shot in a week or in a month, or well, whatever. So there are different graphs that you can use. But you can also look at the group and the grouping pattern. So you can plot multiple groups on a single target phase, or you can plot like a group, each group on a different target phase or on its own target phase, and then compare group sizes. For example, if you want to compare 2 different tunes, you can compare it on a target phase, and I'll show you an example later on in the presentation. So I'd like to show you how you can use, as an athlete or as a coach, Artemis to plot your arrows and to gather as much information about your shooting as you can. There are 3 ways of inputting information. You can do your arrow plotting at the target, you can do your arrow plotting at the shooting line, or you can have someone else plot your arrows. On the left, plotting your arrow at the target phase, you can really accurately position the arrow. You can identify arrow numbers, for example, so you know arrow number 3 where it was landed, and arrow number 5, and so you can position your arrows correct, but you don't know the shooting order in which you've shot the arrows, which can be important as well. Plotting from the shooting line, when in a practice session, you could quite easily look through your scope and then plot your arrow also pretty accurately. Shouldn't be a problem with modern scopes. Or you could have someone else plot your arrows. There are advantages and disadvantages in all 3 cases. Well, if you are plotting your arrows, I'd like to give you a small example on what you can do. So here we have the session list or the match list, and we are going to do a training session. And we start our practice with, for example, 36 arrows of warm-up, but we still want to record that. So we do a volume entry 36 arrows at like blank bale 3 meters. Blank bale 3 meters. So we have 36 arrows, blank bale 3 meters, and we add it to our list. Next up is a small competition of 36 arrows only for score, and we don't enter anything, so you can enter your score. 36 arrows, 70 meter, 6 ends, 6 arrows. So suppose we shot 327, and we enter this. So we have a session with the score, but most important are the sessions where we do our recording. So we create a session that we're going to plot some things. Make sure that you have the setup that you're using, because all the plots are made with this setup, and also the arrow set is correct. Choose the rules that you like to apply. There are many different rules for many different kind of rounds that you have. If you can't find your round, you can always create a custom round yourself. If you have a custom round, you can enter different distances. You can choose any target phase you like that is supported by Artemis, and any format that you like. But we are going to shoot a World Archery outdoor 70 meter round. So now we can only pick a couple of phases. So I'll pick this phase, and we have 6 ends of 6 arrows. We can fill in some extra information also about, for example, the weather and the wind, because we can analyze that later on as well. Suppose we are having a very good day in the Netherlands for shooting. And we save this and we start our match. Well, you can zoom in, zoom out on the target face. You can move the target face around, and you can start the match. At the top you see a couple of tabs. This is the input tab. This is where all the input is done. We have a scorecard tab where we can see a now empty scorecard. We have a group tab. This tab we can run through the different groups that we're shooting. We have an arrow tab. If we also identify each arrow that we shoot, we can also see how each arrow is grouping and behaving. And we have a shots tab, which is where we can have, look at the order that we shot our ends in. So the first shot of each end, the second shot of each end, and the third shot of each end. So let's start with capturing some data. So suppose the archer is shooting. I'll just make a couple of entries just to show you how easy it is to enter some score. So now we have 6 arrows entered. If we look at the scorecard, we see that we have these 6 arrows. They're actually shot in this order, so there's a small 1 here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but it's ordered like we're normally used to, but we already know the order of shooting. Suppose we do that again. So we're entering a couple of scores. So we have our next end. If we don't like to plot, we can also just score our arrows. So if you go to the scorecard and we don't like to plot, you can enter like your arrows over here, 10, 7, 4, 9, 8, 8. So you see that the arrows are entered over here. It doesn't matter if you do this without plotting, you still record some information, which is important as well. So let's go to a bit more advanced use. Suppose you want to also know how good a particular shot was. So we turn on the shot rating and we plot again. We start plotting again. So now we plot a shot over here, and Artemis asks us what was the quality of this shot. So suppose this was a good shot, so we can give it a quality of 3, and we shot a very good shot, technically performed really well, and we shot a bad shot, for example, and we can provide some extra information, and later on we can filter on the quality of the shots. So we can filter, for example, did all my really good executed shots also landed in the center, which can be a problem as well. And did all my badly executed shots, where did they land? For example, do all my badly executed shots land to the right or to the left? So if you add this information to the shot, you can in the end analyze something about the quality of the shot and where they will end up. And as you see also in this small scorecard and in this scorecard, we see that the quality indicator is indicated there as well. Next thing, for example, you want to know if some arrow is misbehaving. So we also want to add the information of each arrow. So we want to identify each arrow. So we can turn that on as well. And now if we plot our arrows, we have to identify it. So it was arrow number 4 that we shot, and it was a very good shot. Let's go to the next end and show it again. So we plot like over here. It asks us which arrow it was. Well, it was arrow number 3, and it was a good shot. Now if we plot again, you will see that arrow number 3 is already used because it's already in the target. So this was arrow number 5, and it was a good shot again. And if you see in the small scorecard, you see extra information appearing. So the small 3, this means it was arrow number 3, and the small 5 means it was arrow number 5. Now if we go into the top group, we can walk through the groups that this archer shot. So we start with end number 1. This was the group of end number 1. End number 2, we have this group. End number 3, we didn't plot the arrows, we only entered score. and end number 4 we have this group. We can also look at the individual arrows. We didn't enter enough arrows yet, but we know that arrow number 3 is hitting here, 4 is hitting there, 5 is hitting there. And you will see the groups appear when you shoot more arrows. And going over to shots, we see that our first shots of every end land here, approximately here. Our second shots of every end land approximately here, etc. So we can do some analysis there as well. So let's continue with a feature in Artemis that I think is a really cool feature, but it is also a very important thing in archery, and it's really important to know how to adjust your sight. And it sounds very trivial that you should know how to adjust your sight, but the fact is that most archers don't. They don't know how to adjust their sight. Artemis can help by learning you how to adjust your sight, by giving this advice during training sessions or practice sessions, how many turns or clicks you should move your sight to get to the center as fast as possible. And you might think that this is something for beginning archers or intermediate archers, but it's not. These photos were taken from the World Championships in Belac. They come from a scientific study done by James Park. And that study analyzed the scores and also the arrow grouping pattern at major international archery competitions. In this case, it was the World Championships. And these pictures, I think we all agree that the archers in these pictures could have gained more points if they would have had their group more centered. And this study actually revealed that how many points that could be. And on the right we see a diagram where we have, this is a recurve women shooting 50 meters, where we see that even the recurve women that shot the highest competition scores, they could gain, or they actually lost 8, 7, 9 points by not having their groups centered. So Artemis can give you a very accurate advice how to get, like the group that you see on the left, how to get this group centered again. But I think it's nice if I give a live demonstration. So let me start this one. So here we have a 70 meter target face. So we're shooting 70 meter. We have a bit older Shibuya sight configured, and the archer can plot, or the coach, if you're standing behind the archer, can plot the arrows and where they land. So let's plot a couple of arrows and make a group that is not centered on purpose. So suppose this is the group. We already see that Artemis has found out that you're not centering your group, and will give you a solution of how to get this group back to the center again. So if you click on it, it will tell you that you have to do 9 clicks to the right and 2 clicks up. So if you accept this advice and you tell Artemis that you moved the sight, the algorithm is reset and you can continue with plotting arrows. Assuming that you reset your sight, you will probably shoot in the center. So this next feature that I'd like to show you is a feature that is called Dare to Dream. And Dare to Dream is, I think, a very nice feature to show your athletes the importance of making sure that your sight is adjusted correctly. What Dare to Dream does is, and I can show you the best by just showing an example, it shows you what if your group was in the center. So how many points did you lose by not having your group in the center? So it's kind of wishful thinking. So let's have a look. This is a list of scores of an archer, and let's have a look at like this 299 at 70 meters. So as coaches we already see that the group is not centered, but how much points did we lose by not having this group centered? So if we go into the group tab, we can already see that the group is not centered, and that there is there's a pretty big group to the top right, and actually Artemis tells us that there are a couple of clusters of arrows. But Artemis can calculate how many points we've lost or would have gained if this group would be dead center. So we press this Dare to Dream button, and it will tell us that there were actually 18 points to be gained in this group. So let's have a look at another session of this archer. Let's take the 308 and check whether this is like a recurring thing. We go to group, press the Dare to Dream button, and we see that there were 8 points in it, in this 308. So even if with this group that looks like it is pretty much centered, there's still 8 points to be gained. Let's take another example, this second 308. Well, it's obvious the group is not centered, but how much? Go to Dare to Dream. This is a huge number of a huge difference. So this function is here to have a discussion with your athlete. Have a discussion well, you can actually, even without shooting smaller groups, gain more points. And you can do that by be very alert in how to set your sight and how to adjust your sight. So this is a feature that I like really very much, and I think that you should try it out as well. If you want to measure the performance of your athlete, or if you want to measure your own performance as an archer, you need some metric for that performance. You need a number that is an indication of how good you are. And in Artemis we're using the archer skill level number for that. So why are we not using score as a number, as an indicator for the archer's performance? Well, score is not a really good performance indicator, because score depends on the distance that you're shooting at, the target face and the target face size that you're shooting at, how many rings a target face has, what the scoring rules are for each ring, and obviously the number of arrows that you're shooting. So score is not really a good performance indicator. So sometimes you can try group size for a performance indicator. So the size of the group. But also group size is not a really good score indicator, because as we know, the group size changes if you shoot longer distances. But even if you're always shooting the same distance, if you look at the bottom 3 examples, all represent the same group size. But I think that we can agree that the right target face represents a much better group than the 2 on the left. So we need an extra metric or another metric to indicate performance. Within Artemis we use the metric that was developed by Archery Australia, and it's called the archer skill level. And it's actually a metric that is independent of the target face that you're shooting at, the scoring rules that you're using, the number of arrows that you shot, and the distance that you're shooting at. It's a number, it's a quite complicated number, but it's a number that represents like the distribution, as you see here, of the arrows over the target. And this distribution, like if it's a very high and small distribution, you have a high skill level, and if it's like a flat distribution, then you have a very big group and it's a low skill level. So on the top left we see my daughter a couple of years ago, and she was aiming in the middle and on average hitting the middle, but with very big groups and very flat distribution. And on the top right we see one of Canadian's top archers, who is also aiming at the middle and hitting the middle very often, and he has a very small group with a very big peak in the center. So this represents the archer skill level. And in Artemis, the archer skill level appears in many different images. So if we look at, for example, the list of sessions that an archer has done, so these are all different sessions on the left with different distances, different target faces, different number of arrows. So we have a lot of different scores here. But if we look at the column with the skill level, we can actually see the skill level of the archer in this column. If we look at the scorecard, we have a skill level on the bottom here. So even if we do not plot arrows but only enter the scores, we still have a skill level indication. And in Artemis, if you look at groups, if you have displays where a group is shown, in the center of the group there's always a number, and this number represents the skill level as well. And also in graphs, in Artemis we can make graphs for skill level versus time, and you can see the skill level on this axis, and you can see like the growth in performance of this archer, even though we don't know which distances the archer shot, how many arrows he shot, but we still see a performance trend in this graph. Now I'd like to give you an example in how Artemis can help you with tuning your bow, and especially fine-tuning your bow. I think fine-tuning is not that easy as we might think. Fine-tuning is not just visually confirming that an arrow flies straight, because that's not fine-tuning. And fine-tuning is not shooting for score, 36 arrows, and if the score increases your bow is tuned better. And it's not following rules of thumb where your bear shaft should have landed or whether you're shooting bullet holes. Fine-tuning is gathering a lot of information on how your bow performs, so gathering the performance indicator, the grouping performance indicator, and compare the indicator in a before and after fashion, which is what we did. This is an example of a recurve women archer with a tuning change. Before she recorded about almost 1,000 shots, and we see these 1,000 shots in the top picture over here. They're not all drawn in by Artemis, because Artemis cannot draw like more than a couple of hundred shots, but a subset is drawn in, but the group is calculated from all the 1,000 shots that were actually plotted. And here we see an after picture where almost 600 shots were plotted with the change in setup. And if we look at both numbers, we have the skill level in those two groups, and if we compare the two skill levels, so we had a skill level of 87 before we changed the setup, which would be around 620 in a 70-meter round, and we ended up with a setup of 92, which would mean around 638 score in a 70-meter round. And if you're shooting these two scores in a typical World Cup qualification round for recurve women, instead of ending up around position number 38, you would end up around position 18. So in this case, this archer would have gained 20 positions by improving the tuning of her bow. And gaining 20 positions means that your opponent is 20 positions more down, so it means that you gain 40 positions compared to your opponent in the first elimination round. And by the way, the pattern that you see here is a typical recurve pattern. We found out that recurve archers tend to shoot more like down arrows, miss their arrows more on the downside than on the upside of the target, and this is a typical recurve pattern, but that was not like the focus of the bow, the tuning change. I'd like to show you a example of how to do that with Artemis live. So if we start up Artemis, so here we have Artemis, it's already configured for this specific compound archer, and if we look at her bow setup, she actually has two bow setups. We have a bow setup before a tuning change and a bow setup after a tuning change. And the tuning change was really very small. It's about 1/8 of an inch draw length difference, and it resulted in about a pound draw weight difference. So how would you go about as a coach or as an athlete in analyzing this? So suppose you did all the shooting, and she shot at, it's a field archer, so she shot a lot of practice ends, competition ends, field, target, many different competitions at many different distances. So how would we go about in analyzing this? So we check multi-view, so we want to have two target faces, one target face representing the data set of all the arrows with the old setup, and one target data set with all the data with the new setup. So we create a data set and we call it before, and we activate this data set, and now we like Artemis to find all the arrows that were shot with a bow setup, with a specific bow setup, the bow setup called before. So now we have a data set with all the data of the bow setup before. We can check if this data set results in data points. So we will get 1200 plotted arrows with this bow setup. And we'd like to compare that with a data set, and we go and create a second data set, and we call this after. And again, we are going to select plots that were made with a specific bow setup, the bow setup called after. And now we check how many data points we get. We get 1600 data points in this setup. So now we have to choose where we like to compare these two results, on what kind of target face we like to compare the results. As I said, it's a field archer, so she would have shot these data sets on many different distances and many different target faces, so it would be really difficult to compare the two data sets. Artemis can help you by calculating where every arrow would have landed if it would have been shot at, for example, 50 meters. Or 70 meters, or so you can pick a distance here, then Artemis will calculate where the arrow would have gone if it would have been shot at 50 meters. So we can do a really good comparison. So suppose we choose 50 meters, we get a result like this. Let's try and zoom in a bit. Again, not all the arrows are drawn in, because we know it's about 1200 arrows on top and 1600 arrows at the bottom. But the groups are calculated according to the total arrows. A second thing that we see is that some arrows look to be like big diameter arrows, or even very big diameter arrows, and some arrows small diameter arrows. This is not really the case. Artemis is like calculating if you were shooting an arrow at 10 meters and you want to plot that arrow at 50 meters, there's some inaccuracy in calculating where that arrow would have landed. So the bigger circles are actually arrows that were shot really close by, and there is some inaccuracy in calculating where that arrow would have landed at 50 meters. So that's why we see different diameters here. But it's not different diameter arrows, it's like the certainty or the uncertainty that Artemis has in where the arrow would have landed at 50 meters. So now we can compare the two setups exactly at 50 meters, and we can compare the two skill levels that we see in the center of the groups. And again, if we would have shot this setup, the before setup, in a world archery competition, a 50-meter competition in this case, we would have ended up with 667. And if we would have shot the new setup in a world archery competition, we would have ended up with 674. That's about 7 points difference. And in a typical world archery qualification round for women compound, it's about 1 point per position. So you would have gained 7 positions. And again, your first elimination round opponent would be 14 positions lower than you would have if you didn't do the tuning change. So it's a really nice tool to check different tunings, and it can be anything. You can like change the fletching that you use, you can change the draw length, you can change, well, anything you can think of, even combinations, although I wouldn't do that, but you can even change combinations and then find which combination or which tuning performs best. So how can you as a coach benefit from the use of Artemis? So suppose you're athletes or a couple of your athletes are using Artemis, and they are recording all their information and plotting data, and they are using it to their fullest, and all the data is kept on their device. They can choose to upload that data to their Google Drive and give you as a coach permission to view that data. So you, on the other hand, and on the other side of the country, can load in their databases one at a time and analyze your athlete's performance. I'd like to show you in a real live example. So if we go into the in the app and we go to the part where we can choose an athlete, so we switch athlete and we choose some kind of athlete, specific athlete that we like to look into, and for example we want to know his weekly volume. So we go into a graph and we ask for the weekly volume of this athlete, so we can again make a data sample. So what we like to compare is we like to compare practice versus competition volumes, for example. So we select on match practice and we like to compare that with competition. So we create a filter where we filter on competition, which will result in 185 competitions, and this is practice, and that results in more than 1,000 practice sessions. So now we want to have a look at the volume, the weekly volume of this archer, and we can see the weekly volume, and I think that you can see as well that there's a nice well, almost every week there is a competition, and this is the weekly volume and the competition volume. We can even look into like daily volumes, apply the same filter, so we have a practice and competition, look at the same data, and we have to zoom in a bit further. So here we see the daily volumes, and I think one of the things that is nice is to see that there's a competition every weekend. So it's a couple of days, then a competition, a couple of days, then a competition. So this is a typical schedule of an archer practicing during the week and having a competition in the weekend. So the next example is a really nice example, and it's also from actual data, from an actual archer shooting a World Cup in Wroclaw in 2013, and also shooting the World Archery Championships in 2013. And here we have the entries of the World Cup in Wroclaw. So we have 4 entries because we shot 4 rounds, a 1440 qualification round. And if we look at the grouping of the World Cup in Wroclaw, which is what we did because we plotted everything and we looked at the grouping afterwards, I already created the tag. So this is a filter that will show you all the arrows that were shot in Wroclaw on a 70-meter target. And this is the grouping pattern. I can show you the arrows as well. So when we sat down with this athlete and confronted her with this pattern, she told us that she wasn't aware that she was actually not shooting in the center, that her arrows felt good and felt like they were hitting the middle. So that was kind of a strange observation. So we tried to find a reason for that, and what we did was we were looking at, this is the shooting, the pattern of all arrows, but now we're going to look at the pattern where we plot the first shot of each end on one target face, the second shot of each end on one target face, and the third shot of each end on one target face, etc., etc. So we get 6 target faces, and I have to select only the arrows from Wroclaw, and we're going to show that on the target face. And now it kind of makes sense a bit. The archer is shooting all her first arrows of each end in the center. All her second arrows of each end more or less in the center. All her third end arrows are also more or less in the center. But gradually, when she reaches the end of each end, her arrows start to, on average, drop down and go to the left. So when we sat down and confronted her again with this, with these 6 pictures, then she understood what was happening. She looked at the first 2 arrows and decided not to adjust her sight if the first 2 arrows were well enough in the center. But then she got kind of impressed by the fact that she had a really good end and she lost some tension each end, and the arrows would drop down and drop to the left. In the next competition, after she knew, she shot the World Championships in Belek, and those are these 3 rounds. And we can compare the 2 groups that she shot. So the group that she shot in Wroclaw and the group that she shot in the World Championships. So let me get rid of all these filters. Let me get rid of this one. And plot again the group in Wroclaw and plot the group in, let's call this Belek. And let's see if things changed. So before she shot in Wroclaw, her last few arrows per end were actually dropping left and down a bit, and when she shot Belek, she had a very good group. And in fact, if you really look close, the group are the same performance indicator, so the same skill level, but because this group is centered, we get a bit more points. And if we look at the 2 competitions, in Wroclaw she had a 12:59 and in Belek she had a 12:78. So with the same performance and the same skill level, but with a better centered group. So when you're coaching bigger teams, you are not only interested in their raw performances, so their scoring ability or their or how much volume or arrows they practice, but you might be interested in like their mental well-being as well. And Artemis can help with that by what's called instantaneous self-assessment or self-reflection questions. So you and your coaching staff can define a couple of questions that you like to ask your athletes every time they start a practice session or a competition. So questions like, how did you sleep, or how do your muscles feel, or what is your current focus? So those types of questions you can define and have your athletes answer, and you as a coach and your coaching staff can collect all that data and like collect it through the technique that I showed you earlier through Google Drive, and collect all the data. And as you see on the left, this is a dashboard from one of the teams, international teams that are using Artemis specifically for this. You can compare those answers to those self-reflection questions and compare them with, for example, their performances or their training results. So the left side is a custom solution for an international team, but it is all based on data that was recorded and gathered with Artemis. So we're almost at the end of the presentation. I'd like to show you a couple of new developments that we are involved in the last few years. One of them is the integration of Artemis with a chest band that is able to record heart rate. So a very simple polar chest band is connected to Artemis via Bluetooth, and with that connection we can measure heart rate, but more importantly heart rate variability. And heart rate variability can be used to calculate stress and stress indication. So now we're able to record the level of stress that an archer perceives during a competition or training, and that's also stored in Artemis, and we can analyze it as we can analyze anything else in Artemis. The next nice development is that in the Olympic Training Center in the Netherlands we have installed an automatic plotting system that integrates with Artemis, so we know where all the arrows land, and we connect that with Artemis and is automatically sent to Artemis. And there's also a commercially available device for this. It's called Ringding. Ringding is a development, not an Artemis development, but it's a very cool development which automatically plots the arrows on many different target faces, and it integrates with Artemis. So if you're using Ringding and you're using Artemis, you don't have to plot your arrows anymore, and they are automatically sent to the Artemis system as well. And finally, we have some integration with bow motion sensors. One of the major score loss mechanisms, especially for recurve archers, is bow canting, or not keeping your bow vertically. And with this system, we can measure that in real time and also give feedback to the archer when they're not keeping the bow vertical. So we've reached the end of my presentation. I want to thank you for your attention. I know it's been a lot of information, but I hope I've made you curious about how you can use Artemis and integrate it in your training program. And to do that, I think you should just start very simple by just downloading the free version. Ask some of your athletes to enter information for every practice session that they start. So information like arrow volume, scoring, or plotting. And know that athletes are fast learners and they're really handy with their mobile devices, so they will find ways in how to operate Artemis on their own. And then after a couple of weeks, sit down and have a discussion with your athlete and try to find how this information can help you as a coach help your archers. And if you do have questions on how to implement Artemis in your training programs, you can always contact me through the app itself or on the website. So thank you again for your attention. Thanks World Archery for organizing this seminar, and I'm ready to answer your questions.
Don't forget, if you've got a question for Austin or Marcel, you can email them us at info@archery.sport or send them via Twitter using the hashtag #ArcheryCoachingSeminar. Well, that's it for this morning's session of the coaching seminar. We'll take a lunch break now, but be back at 1300 Central European Time, that's 1 p.m, with presentations on anti-doping and recurve tuning.